I stood in front of the people who had built the last 30 years of my life with me, and I told them it was over. As of today, I said, the company is finished. That decision is mine to carry, and it stays mine. No one shouted. That was the part I hadn't braced for. I had rehearsed the anger, a room coming apart, someone demanding to know how I had let it happen. And instead, I got silence. 30-odd faces holding very still. The silence landed harder than any shouting would have. I kept my feet. I did not let my voice bend or crack. Whatever else walked out of that room, no one was going to leave it thinking they had sunk this. I had. And even that wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth I only let myself say inside my own skull. One client. 30 years I had trusted him, built entire lines around his orders, borrowed against the future to buy the machines that kept his volume moving, Barrow, and he ended all of it on a cost review. Nothing personal, he would have said, just a number on a page that no longer suited him. The instant that anchor account was gone, the banks called in everything at once, and a company that had survived 3 recessions died over a single cup of coffee, in an office I wasn't even invited to. On the wall behind me hung the founding photograph, a younger me beside the man who had handed me the place, both of us squinting into the sun. I had gone to these people's weddings. I had celebrated the births of their children. I had cut my own salary to 0 and fought for every extra week, and it still had not bought enough time. A young salesman broke the quiet first, one of my newest, barely 2 years in. President, I'm glad I worked here. He got it out fast, like he had to say it before his voice went. Next time, let's do it together again. Others picked it up around the room, low, forcing small jokes about starting over. They were thanking me. I had just put every one of them out of work, and they stood there and thanked me, and I took it standing, like a blade sliding in slow. Their loyalty did not comfort me. It sharpened the whole thing to a point. That night, I went back to the floor alone. It was dark and half torn down already. Machines I had bought with borrowed money sat cold under dust sheets. The floor that used to run hot and loud, presses, hammering, men calling across the line, the whole place alive with the work of making things, stood dead quiet. I could still hear all of it if I closed my eyes. That was worse than if I couldn't. I ran the ledger one more time, the way your tongue keeps going back to a broken tooth. Aggressive equipment investment, loans stacked on loans to cover it, one withdrawn contract that pulled the floor out from under the whole structure inside of a week. Every number was mine. I had signed each one, betting the man on the other end would still be there in the morning. I laid my hand flat on the nearest machine. Cold metal, no hum, no heat, nothing. I did not kneel. I did not put my forehead to that concrete and weep, though a lesser day might have earned it. Something in me was setting instead, hard and cold, the way steel sets as it cools. Never again, I said, to the dark, to no one. Never again the man left holding the keys to nothing. And then a machine answered me, not the dead one under my hand, something across the floor, in the far corner. It hummed. I crossed the floor to it. It was a machine I had forgotten I owned, a squat metal casing wrapped in odd coils of wiring around a central glass sphere, shoved into that corner years back and never touched since. Ethan built it, a subordinate of mine once, a brilliant, restless inventor who swore the thing would change the world, and then walked out one day and never came back. I had meant to send it to the scrappers with everything else, the last loose end of the old life. The sphere was glowing now, on its own, in an empty building with the power half shut off. A sane man clearing out a bankrupt warehouse steps back from a dead machine that starts breathing light, calls someone, leaves. I put my hand on the switch instead, because I was already ruined, and a ruined man has nothing left to be careful with. The light came up out of the glass, white, total, swallowing the corner, and then the floor, and then me, until there was no factory left at all. I woke on grass, warm grass, under a soft spring sky, green hills rolling off in every direction with not a building in sight. That alone told me how far something had gone wrong, because the city I had left was buried in the dead of winter, and here the sun was high and the air was mild, and none of it made any sense. I sat up and checked myself over the way you count stock at close. Wallet, a phone gone dead with no signal at all, a handkerchief, a pen, cigarettes, and a lighter. Everything I'd carried in my pockets, and not one answer among it. So I did the only useful thing a lost man can do. I found a dirt road and I started walking. A cart caught up with me before the sun was overhead. An honest-to-God horse-drawn cart, all wood and hay. A man on the board holding the reins. He called something down at me and I didn't understand a single sound of it. Not the language I was raised in. Not any language I had ever heard a man speak. I spread my hands, pointed down the road, and put on the face of someone with nowhere to be and no way to say so. He looked me over, the strange clothes, the stranger manner, and jerked his thumb toward the hay behind him. I climbed up. I was more worn out than I had let myself notice, and the cart rocked me under within minutes. When I woke, we were rolling in through the gate of a city built out of gray stone. The driver let me down at the edge of a crowded market square and rolled on without a backward glance. I should have been afraid. A grown man set down penniless in a city where he cannot speak, cannot read a sign, cannot name one living face. That is a nightmare, and I knew it was. I stood in the middle of it and felt the fear reach for me. Then I went to work instead. I walked that market the way I had walked 100 trade show floors in my old life. life? What is for sale? What is made by hand? What is missing entirely? And stall by stall, the picture assembled itself. And it was the finest picture I had seen in years. Every pen in that square was a quill that scratched and spat and had to be dipped every third word. Every flame was struck slow off flint and steel, or carried carefully from a neighbor's hearth. The soap was rough gray lye that took the skin off along with the dirt. The candles guttered and stank of tallow. Every cup, every belt buckle, every nail had been made one at a time by one pair of hands. Nothing stamped, nothing cast in a run, nothing made twice exactly the same way. There was not one cheap manufactured good in the whole city, and I knew how to make all of it. Soap, candles that burned clean, matches, pens, 100 small ordinary things this world had never once seen done cheap and done twice. Someone dropped a copper coin into a hat on the ground by my feet, taking me for a beggar. I picked it up and pocketed it and felt no sting at all. It was information. It told me what the coin looked like, what it weighed, and that I could earn one in this city just by sitting still and looking poor. I bought bread and a bowl of hot soup for a few coppers. A room at an inn cost 1 silver piece. I paid it and climbed the stairs. In the room, by the light of one candle, I laid my things out on the blanket and looked at them the way I had not looked at them that morning. Not keepsakes, stock, the pen, the lighter, the cigarettes. Back home, they were pocket junk, the cheapest things a working man carries and loses without noticing. Here, in a world that made everything slowly and by hand, they were the opening inventory of a business no one else alive knew how to run. I couldn't go home. I understood that lying there in the dark, and I waited for the grief to arrive and take its due. What came instead was the old itch, the one I had not felt in years, a market wide open, and not a single competitor in it who knew what I knew. I slept better that night than I had in a very long time. The next morning, I sold my first pen. Not the good one. I held that back. What I set out on the cloth was an ordinary plated ballpoint, the kind that came a dozen to a box where I was from, and I made a quiet show of it. I wrote a clean line across a scrap of paper in front of the gathering crowd. No dipping, no scratch, no blot. The ink simply ran out of the tip, smooth as water, and kept running. To them, it was not ordinary at all. It was a marvel, a slim metal wand that wrote clean over and over and never needed an inkwell, that caught the sun and shone like something only a lord had any business owning. A man in a good coat shouldered to the front and pointed at it, asking the price in words I still couldn't parse. So I spread my hands and let the crowd answer for him. One voice called out a figure, another lifted it, a third went higher still, and the man in the coat cut them all short with a number that killed the bidding where it stood. The pen sold for more silver than I had made in my last 3 months back home, and I did not let my face move. 30 years of running a shop teaches you that the moment a buyer sees you are surprised by your own price, you have already lost the next sale. I closed my hand over the coins, nodded like it happened every day, and turned back toward the stalls. 1 pen, that price. I was not broke in this world. I was rich, and not one soul here knew it yet. I worked the market the rest of that day, reading buyers and prices until the light went, and I was halfway back to the inn when I caught a small shadow shifting in the alley beneath my window. A child, ragged, barefoot, crying, thin in the way a missed supper doesn't cause and a missed week does. When the child saw me and tried to say something, I couldn't follow a word of it. A growling stomach needs no translation. I did the arithmetic on reflex. My own coins were still few. I was 1 bad week from that same alley myself, and I knew it better than anyone. Then I put the arithmetic down. I took out a single silver coin, a night's lodging, real money to me right then, folded it into that small hand, and closed the little fingers over it. Take it, I told the child. Go and eat something. The words meant nothing to those ears. The coin meant everything, and my face filled in the rest. The child smiled up at me. I won't try to explain what that did to a man who had just watched his whole life written off in somebody else's spreadsheet. I laid a hand on the small head, felt how little there was of this kid, all bone and rag, and read the street on every inch of it, an orphan, alone. Then the child slipped off into the dark, looking back at me once, and again, and a third time. I did not know that face would walk back into my life years later, wearing silk. That night, it was only a hungry child and a coin I could not really spare. Back in the room, I took out the pen I had truly been saving, the 3-color one, black, red, and blue. 3 inks running in a single barrel, a thing no hand in this world could hope to match. Tomorrow's headline. Tomorrow, I would take what one plain pen had already proven and turn it into the first stone of something real. First, though, the dull work. I would find cheaper lodging in the morning, somewhere I could hold a while without bleeding silver, and I would start learning the local tongue. A man who cannot count out his own price in a buyer's language gets robbed sooner or later, and I had been robbed enough for 1 lifetime. I closed my fist around the pen. 30 years, gone in 1 cold handshake, in a world I had no way back to. Fine. I had built from nothing once before, with less than this. I still had the one thing Barrow and the banks had never managed to strip out of me. I knew how to make things, and I knew exactly what they were worth, so I would do it again, on my own terms this time, owing no one. And when I built it, no man was going to take it from me over a number on a page. Not ever again. The next market morning, I brought out the thing I'd held back. 1 press of my thumb, and the barrel wrote black then red, then blue, all from a single pen. And the front row went quiet the way people go quiet when they think they've seen a trick and can't find the wire. Back home, it was a child's toy off a stationery rack. Here it was closer to a spell, so I didn't sell it. I let them bid against each other and kept my mouth shut, because the day before had already taught me the one rule that mattered in this market. The moment a buyer sees you're surprised by your own price, you've lost the next sale. A man in a good coat outbid the rest. When it was done, I'd cleared 170 silver for 2 lengths of plastic and ink, more than I'd taken home in a good quarter of running my own shop. I nodded like it happened every day and pocketed the coins. I'd learned the other lesson too. The silver went into a leather pouch on a cord around my neck, under the coat, out of sight. Halfway to the edge of the square, a shoulder slammed mine and a hand went for the cord. It snapped taut and held. By the time I turned, there was only a gap in the crowd where a man had been. I didn't chase him. I put my hand flat over the pouch and kept walking. Lesson learned, cost me nothing, the cheapest kind. I couldn't read a word of the local script yet, so the rental agent and I did business in pictures. He laid 3 cards on the counter. I sorted them from his gestures. Buy a house with gold, sell one for gold, or hand over gold to live in a house that stays someone else's. I tapped the last one. No sense sinking coin into walls when I didn't know yet whether I'd want to stay near this square or a different one. He spread out floor plans and a hand-drawn map and named prices with his fingers. I took the smallest, cheapest shell on the board, a place on the western edge of town, a silver, a month or near enough, far from the center, quiet, mine to make a mess in. A young clerk walked me out to it and handed over the key. I paid the rent and pressed 2 extra copper into his palm, because a man who leads you to your door is worth keeping cheerful. He grinned and left me standing in front of a low stone house I already owned the inside of, if not the outside. Then I opened the door, and the smell of a room shut up for a year rolled out to meet me. It was filthy. I threw the windows and the door wide and let the town air shove the dead air out. The last tenant had left tools behind: a frayed rag, a warped mop, a cracked wooden bucket heavy as a stone after a lifetime of plastic ones. I drew water from the well out back, and it came up brown. I drew it again, and again, more than a dozen times, hauling and dumping, before it ran clear enough to drink. Then I cleaned. Ceiling corners, table, chairs, floor. The windows scrubbed until light actually came through them. When I finally stopped, the muscles in my back had opinions I hadn't heard from in years. The fireplace nearly beat me. I stacked the wood wrong twice and got nothing but smoke, before I remembered a fire needs air more than it needs fuel. Once it caught, I boiled a thin soup. Chicken, potato, onion, salt, nothing else. And it was one of the better meals of my life, which tells you more about the week than the soup. After, I set a worn book and a wooden board by the lamp and started copying the local letters, one clumsy stroke at a time. If I could read, everything changed. Contracts, prices, competitors. Until then, I was a rich man who couldn't tell a bill from a threat, and I turned over what to sell next. Firewood was a fool's margin, but soap was just oil and ash, and a candle was just thread and wax. And I'd watched enough factories run to know that anything simple enough to make is a thing you can make better. I said it out loud to the empty room. I'll do it. Knowing a thing is made of oil and ash is not the same as making it. My first soap stung. I'd run the alkali too strong, and it came off the mold, leaving white powder and a burn on the back of my hand. My first candles were worse. The wax slumped, the flame guttered, and the whole thing drowned itself inside a few minutes. I lined my failures up next to a candle I'd bought in the market and stared until I saw it. I'd been blaming the wax. It was never the wax. It was the wick, the thickness, the twist, the length of it, deciding how fast the flame could feed. Get the wick wrong and the best wax in the world just puddles and dies. So I melted store candles down for their wax and spent a day doing nothing but testing string. Thin, thick, tight twisted, loose. When one finally stood up and burned clean and steady, I let out a breath I felt in my teeth. Then I cut the alkali in the soap until it washed without biting. Oil and ash and string. I had a product. I set out a stall and priced everything a shade under the going rate. For an afternoon, it worked like a charm. A woman picked up a candle, turned it over, and said the one word I'd been praying for: cheap. Others heard it the way shoppers always hear that word, and the little pile in front of me got smaller and smaller. I stood there thinking I'd cracked it. A modern head on a medieval market. Easy. I should have known better. I'd run a business 30 years. Nothing is ever easy. The next morning, nobody stopped. It took me a while to see why. 2 stalls down, a neighbor had laid out candles the same shape, the same thickness, at the same price I'd set the day before. Somebody had bought one of mine, taken it apart, and had copies on a table before I'd finished my breakfast. I couldn't even be angry in a language he'd understand. Soap and candles are simple. That was the whole reason I'd picked them, and it was exactly why any man with eyes could steal them off my table in a night. My edge wasn't the product. I hadn't found my edge yet. I packed the unsold goods while the sellers around me laughed over a good day's take and carried my box home. I made more soap that night, not because I had buyers for it, but because if I sat still, the fear would climb up and sit on my chest. and work was the only thing that ever kept it off. That was the mistake. Tired hands are clumsy hands. A pinch of tea, leaves I'd left on the bench, slid off my fingers into the batch, and the whole pot was ruined. A day's oil, a day's ash, gone in a heartbeat, the way things always seemed to go wrong right at the moment they'd started to go right. I had no coin left for bread. I drank a cup of well water to fill the hole, and it filled nothing. Lying in the dark with my stomach growling loud enough to hear, I thought about the last months of my old company, signing my own payback into the accounts to cover the wages, and still coming up short. Watching people I was responsible for do without because I wasn't enough. The same question I'd carried through a wall between worlds came back and sat on me. Was I going to fail the ones counting on me again? Then I stopped it. There was no one counting on me here, not yet. And a man with nothing left to lose has exactly one move, the next one. It's not over, I told the ceiling. Not yet. In the morning, I looked at the ruined pot again and stopped seeing a failure. The soap still cleaned, and it smelled of tea, faint and green, unlike anything on any stall in that square. I'd been trying to beat the copycats on price. A race to the bottom, I would always lose to a man with less to lose. Wrong game. I couldn't out-cheap them, and I had no name anyone trusted. What I could do was give them something to smell and see that a stolen copy couldn't fake at a glance. So I made it on purpose. Tea soap and tea candles to match. And I didn't make a careful few. I made 100 of each, worked till my arms shook, because a demonstration only pays if there's stock on the table when the crowd turns into a line. I wasn't going to sell soap. I was going to sell the experience of it. I didn't call out prices. I put on a show. I lit a row of the tea candles, so a thread of green scent drifted off the table into the crowd. Then I took out my own handkerchief, dunked it, and washed it right there in front of them. Worked up the lather, rinsed it clean, held the cloth up so they could smell it as they passed. One woman stopped. She leaned in, breathed, and bought a bar without a word of haggling. That was all it took. People trust a thing another person just chose in front of them, and the one sale pulled a second, and the second pulled 5. The line formed itself. By the time the sun dropped, I'd sold all 200 pieces. Every candle, every bar, gone. I counted the coins twice. I let myself feel it for exactly one breath, just one, and then I put my face back on and packed my empty box. On the walk home, I bought bread, still warm, and ate it in the street like a man who'd earned it. I had. For once, I actually had. Selling more meant trusting someone, hiring, partnering, letting another pair of hands near the money. I thought about the last time I'd done that. My company hadn't died of bad luck. It died of a man I trusted moving numbers behind my back. The books cooked. The blame slid onto me. 30 years turned to paper and ash. Barrow's cold handshake was only the last cut. The bleeding had started on the inside, with someone who called himself a friend. So no partners, not yet. I'd build alone, owe no one, and keep every string in my own hand until I understood this world well enough to tell a friend from a knife. I went hunting for materials to do exactly that, and in the back of a hardware store, I found a spool of copper wire. I laughed out loud. The clerk must have thought I was simple. He didn't know a coil of copper was a fortune to a man who remembered what electricity was for. I bought the wire, and copper and zinc plates, and iron rod, and carried it home like it was the wire that had money in it and not me. Everyone in this world thought electricity was a kind of weather. I knew it was a tool, and I knew how to build the tool out of almost nothing. I started with the battery, a copper plate, a zinc plate, and for the sour bath between them, I squeezed the juice of a sharp market fruit into a cup. 2 metals, 1 acid, a wire off each, and when I touched the ends together, a current ran through them that not one soul in Brightwater could have named. Then the magnet. Copper wire wound tight around the iron rod, turn after turn after turn until my fingers cramped, so that the instant the current fed it, the dead iron woke and dragged a nail across the bench on its own. The motor fought me. I got shorts. I got a blue snap of spark that made me drop the whole thing. I got a curl of smoke and a burnt stink, and a coil I had to wind again from the start. Twist the wires, close the gap, try again. Twist, adjust, try again. Then it turned. A little copper armature sitting between the magnet's arms twitched, caught, and spun. Faultless, fast, humming a low, steady note into the quiet house, turning on nothing a single living person here could see, driven by fruit juice and scrap and a memory. I sat back and watched it run, and for a moment, I couldn't have told you my own name. I mounted it under a small model windmill. I built a water wheel to go beside it, and when I fed them the current, the sails came around and the wheel came around, smooth and endless, with no wind and no river anywhere near them. I had toys that moved themselves. In a world that had never seen such a thing, that wasn't a toy at all. That was a marvel with a price on it. I set the little windmill on the table, fed it the current, and let the sails turn. The crowd stopped like a wall had gone up. Children shoved to the front. Grown men leaned over the toy and looked underneath it for the string, the wind, the hand, and found nothing. A wheel and a windmill going around on their own in the middle of a market that had never once seen a thing move without a body to move it. The murmur spread outward through the square. A man in fine clothes came through the crowd without hurrying, the way rich men walk when they already know they'll get what they came for. He watched the sales go around. He asked the price of the lot, not one piece, but all of it. I caught enough of his words and all of his face. I said 3 gold coins. Back home, I'd have chewed my nails raw over a number like that. Here, I said it flat and waited. He didn't blink. He didn't haggle. He counted 3 gold coins into my hand, had the models carried off, and the crowd made way for him as if the wonder had rubbed off onto his coat. 3 gold coins. I stood in the noise of the market and closed my hand around them until the edges bit. I'd sold a pen. I'd sold soap. This was something else. This was the first coin that came out of the thing I actually was. Not a lucky curio out of my pockets, but something I'd built here from scratch. With 2 hands and a head no man could copy off a table overnight. For the first time since a white light tore me out of my old life, the future stopped being a thing I was afraid of and turned into a thing I was going to make. I still built alone. I still owed no one. And standing there with the gold warm in my fist, I was sure, dead sure, that alone was exactly how a man kept what he built. I had never been so wrong about anything in my life, but that came later. 3 gold coins bought me a building with a roof that mostly held. Not a month before, standing in the market with the gold warm in my fist, I had sworn I would build this thing alone. Owe no one. Trust no one. Keep every wall I raised in my own 2 hands. I meant it the way a man means anything right after it has just been proven to him. Then the soap outgrew my rented room, and the candles outgrew the soap, and I found myself in the middle of a cold brick factory with more orders than 1 pair of hands would ever fill. The vow started to look like what it was, a comfort, not a plan. A shop needs hands, and I knew exactly where the unwanted hands of this city were. Nobody else was using them. I carried bread down into the South District and started handing it out. The first day, they scattered from me like I was the tax man. The second day, they took the bread and ran without a word. It took a week of coming back before one of them stopped running long enough to look me in the face. He was maybe 11, sharp-eyed, with a mouth on him. "Why do you keep doing this?" he asked, chewing while he said it, as if he expected the answer to be a trap. "It's surplus," I told him. That was a lie, and a thin one. He knew it too. But a lie a boy can eat is better than a truth he can't. His name was Ken, and once he decided I wasn't going to bite, the questions came fast. Would I actually pay them? Was there a catch? I laid it out plain. A roof, a bed, food, a trade in their hands, and a wage once they earned it, with deductions for what I fed and clothed them. Ken squinted at me a long moment. Then he jerked his thumb at a quiet, careful boy behind him, who hadn't said a word, Romeo, and at a thin girl with a steady gaze who had watched the whole exchange without flinching, Ivy. "They come too," Ken said. It wasn't a request. "They come too," I agreed. People asked me later why I hired the discarded instead of trained help. The desperate work hardest, because they know what waits below them if they slip. And a person you feed when no one else will is cheaper insurance against betrayal than any lock you can buy. I had learned what betrayal costs from a man in a good coat who shook my hand and gutted my life in the same afternoon. I wasn't going to build with people who had anything better to run to. I found the smallest one 3 nights later, wedged into a corner of the shed that leaned against the factory wall, shaking so hard I heard the straw move before I saw the child. Too young to work, too far gone to turn out. I brought over what I had, which was a bowl of soup boiled down from the vegetable scraps I couldn't sell. The child ate the way a starving thing eats, fast, hunched, one arm curled around the bowl to guard it from a world that had taught it to guard everything. It wasn't enough. I could see it wasn't enough, and there wasn't any more. "Sorry," I said. "This is all I've got tonight." The child looked up at me with the soup still on its chin and whispered, "It's okay. I'm sorry. Sorry." As if being hungry were a thing it owed me an apology for. I went back inside and drank a cup of water to put out my own hunger, because the coins that would have bought my supper were already spoken for, and I told myself the oldest lie a poor man tells, that tomorrow I would simply earn more. I had been that child once, in another life, in another world. I did not let myself think about it for long. Thinking about it never fed anyone. The boys learned faster than any grown apprentice I ever trained. I showed them the soap once, how to cut the lye, work the oil, pour, and set the molds. And Romeo had it clean by the second try. Quiet, exact. The kind of boy who lined the bars up square without being told. Ken was quicker and messier, and never made the same mistake twice, which in a workshop is worth more than being careful. Candles next. The wick set true, the wax poured at the right heat. Within a fortnight, the two of them ran the floor while I worked on other things. They still didn't quite believe it, though. That first night in the lodging beside the factory, none of them slept. I heard them through the wall, 3 of them lying awake in real beds, 2 wound up to trust the beds would still be there in the morning. I put Ivy out front, in the little shop I'd knocked together at the gate. The first days, she could barely get the greeting out. She'd say it to the floor, to her own hands, to anywhere but the customer's eyes. I'd left the scent sachets cracked open so the smell reached the street before the sign did, and that pulled people in. But a shy salesgirl loses them again inside a minute, so I stood beside her and let her watch. How you meet a customer's eyes, how you name the thing they're already leaning toward, how you close a copper coin's worth of trust before you ever mention the price. She caught it the way she caught everything, fast and then all at once. One evening, she came running across the yard with the day's takings and pushed the bag into my hands, heavier than yesterday's, grinning like she'd stolen it. "Better than yesterday," she said. "Buy a lot. Do it again tomorrow." I told her, and meant it as praise. She took it as one. With the floor running itself, I finally had hands free for the thing I actually wanted to build. I made a higher line of soap first, flower oils pressed out of lily and rose, and whatever the wildflowers gave up, 100 bars only, so the scarcity did half the selling. Candles that threw their scent into a room when you lit them. Then, because I could, a wind-up toy, gears and a crank, and a little cat that chased a little mouse around a tin garden, a thing no one here had seen move without magic. I priced it at 5 gold coins, and a wealthy house bought it inside a day, but the piece I sat up nights for was smaller and quieter than any of it. I ran the copper from my little acid battery into a thread of scorched fiber sealed inside a blown glass bulb, and I burned through a dozen failures, threads that flared and died, glass that cracked, sparks that bit my fingers. Then one night the thread caught and held, a small steady glow, no flame, no smoke, sitting in the glass like a trapped star. Ken and Romeo stood there staring at it with their mouths open. Ken asked, barely above a whisper, whether it was magic. No, I said. It's better than magic. Magic you have to be born with. This anybody can build. I sat with the little light a long while after the boys went to bed. It didn't flicker, and it couldn't burn a house down, and I already knew it was worth more than every candle I'd ever poured. Word got around that the factory gave out bread and soup, and would pay a copper for an afternoon of sweeping or carrying. To an orphan in that city, that was close enough to a miracle. So I set up a soup line, and they came. Dozens of them, thin as fence rails, clutching their bowls like the bowls might be taken back. One small boy near the front held his bread up to his face before he ate it, breathing it in like it was warm bread and not day-old crust. He took a slow, careful bite and said to no one and to everyone that it was delicious. He said he'd come again tomorrow. I was too busy counting bowls to think much of it. What I didn't see, what I only pieced together later, too late, was the man at the far edge of the square. Well-dressed, shoes too clean for that district, a heavy ring catching the light when he moved his hand. He never came near the line, never touched a thing anyone could point to. He just watched the children, the way a merchant watches stock he hasn't paid for yet, counting which of them came alone, which of them no one would ever come looking for. The line thinned, the children scattered back into the alleys. The man in the good coat was gone before I ever thought to wonder who he'd been. The small boy did not come back the next day. No one could say when he'd stopped being there. He wasn't hurt, wasn't sick that anyone knew, wasn't anywhere. He was simply not among them, and the square carried on bright and ordinary, as if it had never held him at all. Ivy noticed before I did. She kept scanning the line for one face that always came early and always smiled, and it hadn't been there for days. We'd never written the children's names down, never learned their faces on purpose. So all she had was a wrongness she couldn't prove. She told me that evening, twisting her apron, and I heard how thin it sounded, even as she said it. Later, at the ledger, I found my own thin, wrong thing. The count of bowls we'd handed out ran higher than the count of children I remembered serving. Some days, by as many as 20. I checked it twice, and the numbers still refused to agree. I told myself it was an ordinary mistake somewhere in the tally. The way you tell yourself anything you don't have the room to carry. Out in the yard, near where the line had stood, a child's worn shoe lay on its side in the dirt. No child, just the shoe. I didn't have a name for what was wrong. I only knew, before my head could say it, that something was hunting at the edge of the warm thing I'd built, and I couldn't prove a word of it. The next wrong number had a name on it. The sales were climbing, but the coin didn't climb with them. A small gap between what we sold and what came back, widening a little each week. Small enough to be an error, steady enough not to be. By the third recheck, I knew I wasn't looking at a mistake. I was looking at a thief. I called in the two who handled the money. Nolan, the older one I'd made my sales chief, and Ivy. Ivy didn't wait to be asked. She said it wasn't her, flat and steady, her hand tight on her ledger, and I believed her before she finished the sentence. You learn the sound of an honest denial after 30 years of hearing every other kind. Nolan wouldn't look at me. He looked at the desk, at the door, at his own hands. When I laid the figures in front of him, he folded. He'd been skimming, a little at a time, telling himself no one would ever miss it. When he understood I already knew, the whole story came out in a rush. And then the begging came after it. He'd pay it back, he'd work it off. Please, not the guards. I fired him, said the word, and watched it land. Then I took it back. I told him he'd repay every copper out of his wages. He'd never touch money again. Double books, another set of eyes on every count, and there would be no third conversation. The next time, it was the guards, and I'd walk him there myself. He wept and swore he'd never forget it. Ivy watched me the whole time like I'd lost my mind, and maybe I had. I couldn't be the man who threw people away. I'd been thrown away once, and I knew exactly what it made of a person. I told myself I'd bought a loyal man cheap. I didn't hear the crack I'd just left open in my own house. That came later, and it cost me everything. Cheap copies of my soap and candles started turning up 2 streets over. Worse quality, my scents, my shapes, my prices undercut. Being copied is a kind of compliment, but a compliment doesn't pay wages. So I gave my work a mark no copyist could fake in a night. A circle with a pen stamped inside it. The pen that first fed me in this world, pressed into every bar, and a lot number under it, the date and a running count. So a buyer could tell mine from a fraud at a glance. Let them copy the soap. They couldn't copy the trust. I took on more hands too, set out blocks of wood and had the hungry ones sort them by shape. Fed them all first because a starving child can't think past bread, and kept the two who worked cleanest. I couldn't keep them all. I've never made peace with that. Then I did something kind that turned around and bit me. I gave the workers a day off, 1 day a week, a thing this world had apparently never heard of. They came back the next morning to a broken lock and a stripped shelf. Every one of the high-end toys, gone. The thief had known exactly which day the shop stood empty. The city guards took my report the way you'd take a report of rain, and nothing would come of it. So I hired my own, 2 rough vagrant youths with strong shoulders, and gave them batons and rope and one hard rule. If it turns dangerous, you run, I told them. A toy I can build again. You, I can't. Don't you dare trade your life for my stock. They looked at me like no one had ever put it in that order before. Then I sat down and started building the toys again. The state noticed me next. A man from the Humphrey Chamber of Commerce turned up at my gate with clean credentials and a calm, careful voice. He explained very politely that the Merchant Guild was a state body that decided who got to trade at any real size, and that a factory like mine could not simply exist outside it. Registration was expected. He never actually threatened me. He didn't have to. The shape of it sat right there under the courtesy, join, or the state would find legal reasons to suspend the business and seize what I'd built. I heard him out. I even thanked him. When the door shut behind him, I found, to my own surprise, that I wasn't afraid. I was interested. If they wanted to play by the rules of the guild, then I would learn those rules better than the men who wrote them, and beat them inside their own fence. All right, I said to the empty office. I'll take them on. So I went and registered and did it on my own terms. Eyes open, nothing signed I hadn't read. The guildmaster was nothing like the man who'd come to lean on me. Warm, almost cheerful, and he laid the whole bargain out straight. A fee to join. My sales ledgers open to them. 10 parts in 100 of everything I earned handed over as tax. I grumbled about that last one, inside where it didn't show. But the other side of the ledger turned out to be real. No more toll every time a cart of mine crossed a bridge or a gate. A relief fund if bandits or fire wiped a merchant out. Carriages and hired guards to rent when I needed to move goods far. It wasn't a shakedown. It was insurance and a road network. And I'd have built worse myself. I signed. 10 parts in 100 is a great deal of money. It's also cheap if it buys the right to keep building where they can't touch you. By then, I was tired of hunting for hungry children through the alleys every single day. So I decided to stop hunting and start housing. There was empty land beside the factory. I put the soup kitchen on it properly, a place where any vagrant could work for a meal, sweeping, hauling, sorting scrap into something worth selling. The grown ones got fed enough to keep the peace. The children got fed first, always first. I'd seen what a room of desperate adults does when the food runs thin, and I made sure it never came to that. Then, out of gathered timber and scrap and whatever the crew could raise, we built a simple long house on the lot. Nothing fine. A roof, walls, a row of raised beds off the cold ground. An orphanage, if you wanted a grand word for it. To me, it was just beds that belonged to somebody. My 8 workers ran it between them now. Shop, guard, kitchen, floor. The ragged, empty land had started to buzz, full of people and smoke and noise, where a month ago, there'd been nothing at all. The night the children moved in, I lit the room with the little glass bulbs instead of candles, and no one flinched from the light because there was nothing in it to fear. They came in wary, hovering at the edges, waiting to be told to catch. I sat them at the plank table and put a bowl of soup in front of each, more than they were used to, and watched the shoulders come down one by one as they understood there was enough. The small one from the shed had a bed now, off the floor, with a blanket. Ken and Romeo took the far end like they owned it. Ivy moved down the row, making sure the littlest ones ate before she did. I stood in the doorway and looked at the whole ragged lot of them under that steady light, and I said the thing I'd been carrying since the shed. This is your home now. Nobody takes it. You eat here, you sleep here, and you're not going anywhere you don't choose to. I didn't dress it up. A few of them just nodded, the way children nod when a thing is too big to answer. But I saw a couple of them stop chewing to look at me, checking whether I meant it. I meant it. It wasn't charity, or not only. The place doubled as a school of work. They'd learn to farm the plot, mind the chickens, run the floor, read and write an hour a day for a bit of sweet as a reward. Just eating to live isn't living, I told them. If you work, you get to live. For a child with nothing, that was the closest thing to a promise anyone had ever made them. For one night, the warmth was the whole of it. A full room, full bowls, a light that couldn't burn. But I'd built that warmth in one bright, predictable place, and something out there had noticed. A child was still gone, and I couldn't prove how. A man in a good coat had counted my orphans from the edge of the square, and down the row, safe under my roof, sat a man I'd caught stealing and forgiven anyway, nursing a debt he'd never asked to owe. 2 quiet fuses, both lit, both burning toward the same house. I couldn't see either one clearly yet. I only knew that for the first time in either of my lives, I had something worth taking. And somewhere in the dark past, the light, someone had already started counting it. A boy caught my sleeve at the gate before I'd finished unlocking it. He was maybe 9, snot and tears all down his face, and he was holding up a single shoe like it was evidence in a trial. He took my brother, he kept saying. He took him. His brother was gone. That was all I could get out of him at first. Gone, gone. And this shoe was all that was left. I crouched, took the shoe, and made him breathe and tell it slow. They'd come for the soup line. The little one couldn't keep up, dropped back a few steps rounding the corner by the gate, and by the time the boy turned around, there was nobody there. Just the shoe in the dirt, one lace still tied. I'd seen a shoe like that before. Different child, different corner, the same silence after. I told myself then it was bad luck. A man tells himself a lot of things when he doesn't want to know the answer. This was not a child wandering off. A child who wanders leaves a trail, a direction, a witness, a scream. This left one shoe and no noise at all, in a crowd, in daylight, with grown men who happened to be standing at the edges, watching the children instead of the food. That is not bad luck. That is a trade, and somebody was good at it. I gave the boy back his shoe and told him to keep it. Then I went inside and started thinking about how you make a child impossible to steal. I could not put blades in children's hands. Even if I'd had the blades, a trained crew would take those too, and then I'd have armed the very men hunting them. What a child can do is throw all at once and run. So I built them something to throw. Ash from the stoves, dried chili ground fine, a few drops of oil to make it hang in the air instead of falling, packed into little cloth twists you could palm and burst with one squeeze. Nothing that cut, nothing that killed, just a fistful of misery aimed straight at the eyes. Then I drilled them. For 3 evenings in the yard, I taught them the way I'd once taught a floor of grown men to run a line without crashing into each other. Watch the wind. You never throw into your own faces. Watch my hand. One signal. Everybody together. Because one packet is a nuisance, and 30 at once is a wall. Then don't chase. Don't gloat. Seal the gaps and let them run into each other trying to leave. Ken took to it like a game he fully intended to win. Romeo said almost nothing and lined his packets up in a neat row, counting them twice. The small ones practiced the signal until they could throw it in their sleep. I told them once, plainly, what it was for. If you want to keep your brothers and your friends, I said, you remember this. Nobody argued. They had all lost someone to that quiet. Soup day came, and I felt them before I saw them. You learn a crowd when you've worked one for 30 years. A soup line has a shape. Hungry people drift toward the pot. These men drifted the other way, toward the children. And they didn't drift like they were hungry. I counted them the way I count stock. 2 by the gate, 2 working in from the alley mouth. More at the edges, hands loose, faces bored in a way that took real effort. At least 8, a crew. I got the children into their places without letting my face move, and I waited. Because you do not spring a trap on empty air. You spring it on the hand. The hand came fast. A man near the gate closed on a small girl at the back of the line. Quick, smooth, a palm over her mouth, already turning to walk her out like she was his own. I dropped my hand. Then it was Ash. 30 packets burst on the windward side at once, and the wind carried them exactly where I'd promised it would. The square went white and bitter in a heartbeat. The man holding the girl caught the first of it full in the face. I saw his hands fly up, saw her drop and scuttle away, and the rest of the man who came to my gate that week was the most polite person I had ever met. And that was the first thing wrong with him. He introduced himself as Director Mercer of the Sun House Orphanage, bowed a fraction too low, thanked me a fraction too warmly, praised the place before he had seen a single room of it. Everything about him moved like it had been rehearsed in a mirror. I run a house of children who never sit still. Nothing about this man was unstudied, and that alone set my teeth on edge. I walked him through. He admired everything and meant none of it, and I know that because I recognize the look. It is my look. I have walked 100 factory floors wearing exactly that face. He was not seeing children. He was taking inventory, his eyes counting heads down the table, weighing the pot, measuring the beds against the floor, pricing the whole operation while his mouth said how wonderful, how ideal it was to save even one child. He stopped by one of the little ones and patted her head, a kind gesture. If the fingers hadn't moved the way they did, turning her chin a touch toward the light, feeling the set of her, the way you check the shape of a thing before you decide what it's worth. She smiled up at him. I had to hold my own face very still. He left me an invitation to tour the Sun House, said it would be his honor, and I gave him something non-committal and meant none of that either. On his way out, his smile slipped for half a second, and what sat under it had already decided what I was worth to him. Then it was back, and he was gone. And I stood in my own doorway with a sudden foolish urge to go and count the children. I went, of course. You do not turn down a look inside the thing you are afraid of. The Sun House was beautiful. White walls without a scuff, flower beds without a weed, front rooms polished until they gave the light back at you. The whole district loved it. Nobles donated, merchants pointed to it as proof the city had a soul. From the front step, it was everything an orphanage should be, and everything mine was not. The children were lined up to greet me, heels together, hands flat at their sides, eyes forward. And when the director gave the word, they bowed in one motion, like a single body with 40 heads. They spoke their welcome in one flat voice, perfectly together, not a giggle or a shuffle among them. I told him it was remarkable. It was. That was the problem. I have children, fed, housed, safe children, and they are a riot. They fidget, they whisper, they pick their noses in front of guests. They are gloriously unable to stand still. That is what a child is. These stood like fence posts. Not one glanced at the stranger in the room. Not one leaned to murmur to the next. 40 children held that line, every face wearing the same pleasant, even expression. And it was not calm. Calm has a bottom to it. This had been drilled down past the bottom until there was nothing left underneath but the drill. He walked me through bright, spotless room after bright, spotless room, talking gently about order and gratitude, and every door he opened was clean and ordinary and gave me nothing at all to point at. In a hall near the back, they performed for me, a song and a small dance. Every voice matched, every step landing on the same beat. It was flawless. It was the most unsettling thing I had seen since the shoe. There was no joy in it anywhere. Someone had taken the noise and the mess and the life out of these children with great care and left the shape behind, moving in time. Then one of them broke it. A small girl in the second row turned her head, found my eyes, and waved. Just once. A quick, sloppy, ordinary wave. The kind any child throws at a stranger. Then she caught herself and snapped straight again, eyes forward, folded back into the line. It stopped my heart for a beat, and then, oddly, it steadied me. One wave. It meant that whatever they had done to turn these children into furniture, they had not finished. Somewhere in that row, an actual child was still in there, and she had just reached out through the bars to say so. The director noticed nothing, or pretended to. He answered my careful questions with careful modesty. The children's own efforts, he said. They still have so much to learn, and never once let the tour drift toward a door he had not chosen for me. At the gate, he shook my hand. His grip was warm and dry and correct, and the moment he let go, I caught myself wiping my palm on my handkerchief without having decided to. I walked back out into the ordinary filthy roar of the city, the shouting, the mud, children screaming over nothing, and it felt like coming up for air. I was certain, all the way home, that the man was a monster in a clean collar. I was just as certain I could not prove a word of it. You cannot walk into a magistrate and accuse a beloved charity of a feeling. So I did the only thing left to me. I kept the little girl's wave, and I waited. And I watched the man the same way he had watched my children. Here is the part I only understood much later, when it was all over and I could stand in the wreckage and read the ashes backward. When the last admiring visitor was gone and the lamps burned low, the gentle director became the other thing he was. The streets had a name for that other thing, the broker, and the Sun House, for all its white paint, had never been a charity. It was a warehouse. He kept ledgers the way I keep ledgers, and lately his numbers were coming out wrong. The supply had dried up. A nervous man brought him the count, and he made the man say it out loud. Fewer children off the streets. Week after week, almost none now. When he pressed for the reason, he got the same answer every time, and the answer was me. My company was feeding the orphans, learning their names, keeping them counted and in the light, and teaching them to spot a hunter and blind him. You cannot quietly steal children that a whole district knows by name. He did not rage about it. That is the part that should frighten you. He sat with it the way a merchant sits with a supplier who has cut him off, a little irritated, entirely calm, and he did his arithmetic and reached the only conclusion the arithmetic allowed. As long as my company stood between him and the streets, his trade would keep bleeding. So the company had to go, not in the open, where I was strong and well-liked. Some quieter way, not yet chosen. Then he folded the cold thing back inside the warm one, put the director's smile away for the morning, and went to his bed. Somewhere across the city, I was folding cloth packets of ash and thinking I was winning. I had drawn first blood, and I was proud of it. And I had just been marked for erasing by a man whose hand I had shaken. I did not slow down. There were more children every week, and every one of them ate. And the money to feed them came out of things I had not invented yet, so I invented them. I worked the floor by day and the bench by night under the little glass bulb that never needed a flame, and I ate when I remembered to, which was less and less. There is a lie a working man tells himself, that he'll rest once the next thing is finished. There is always a next thing. I had been telling myself that lie across two different worlds for the better part of 40 years. One night, the workbench tilted. That is how it felt. The whole bench swinging up sideways while I sat perfectly still. The light smeared. My own hands went far away from me. I remember thinking, with the flat clarity you get at the worst moments, that I hadn't finished yet, and then the floor came up and took the thought clean away. I woke in my own bed and could not get out of it. Not wouldn't, couldn't. My body had sent in a bill for 2 lifetimes of overwork, and it was collecting the whole sum at once. The doctor was cheerful about it, the way doctors are when you are not actually dying. Overwork, he said. A week of rest and you'll be back to ruining yourself in no time. Then he stopped being cheerful for a moment. He told me my heart had been laboring, that there was a strain in it he did not love, that a body like mine would not take heat and exhaustion the way it had at 20, and that a man who ignored that tended to get one warning before he stopped getting warnings at all. He told me to slow down. Then he packed his bag and left, and I lay there and knew that I wouldn't. I was bedridden a week. It gave me time to notice something I had been too busy to feel. I was alone. An employee knocked once about a design, and I sent him off. After the door shut, the room went very quiet, and I lay in it and finally did the sum I had been avoiding. No wife, no children of my own. In the old world, through all the years a man builds himself a family, I had built a company instead, and the company was gone. If I stopped now, if I simply stopped, there was no one whose day would change for it. I had told myself for so long that I liked it that way. Lying there, I could not quite remember why. Then someone knocked who would not take being sent away. It was Ivy, holding a bowl in both hands like it might bolt. Wheat porridge, still steaming. She set it down on the table by the bed. "You have to eat," she said. I told her I wasn't hungry. She just looked at me until I picked up the spoon. She had grown, that girl. The wary street child I had hired was giving her boss orders now and not blinking once. Behind her, the door creaked, and a face appeared at knee height and vanished. Then it came back. Ken, who is never shy about anything on this earth, edged in red to the ears, set something on my blanket, and stepped back like he had just delivered a live bomb. It was a nut. One nut, cracked and half crushed in a hot little fist, offered up like a crown jewel. "Will you eat it?" he mumbled, and when I thanked him, he broke into a grin and bolted. And then they all came. They came one at a time and in twos, the whole ragged parade of them, each clutching a treasure. A boy held up a pair of bird eggs he had found and guarded all morning. A girl had flowers, already wilting in her grip. Someone brought bread crusts, given to a grown man by children who not long ago had nothing at all. Someone else pushed 3 strawberries into my hand and told me with great seriousness that these were the sweet ones. So I had to get better now. Romeo came last and quiet, and only stood at the foot of the bed until I met his eyes and nodded. And that was his whole gift, and it was more than enough. "Get well soon, Uncle Walter," they said. Uncle Walter. Nobody had ever called me that. Nobody had called me anything that wore in longer than I cared to count. I got them out of the room somehow, thanked them, told them to run along, kept my voice level until the last small foot had crossed the threshold. Then I pulled the blanket up over my face. This hard, practical man who trusted no one and needed nothing, and I cried into it without a sound. The way you cry when you are 50 years old, and the thing that has finally broken you is a crushed nut, and a bird's egg, and a handful of strawberries somebody swore were the sweet ones. I had spent 2 lifetimes making very sure I would never need anyone, and a crowd of children I had fed out of guilt had just walked in and proved, without even trying, that somewhere along the way, I had gone and built the one thing I swore I never would. A family, the kind that shows up. I whispered thank you into the dark under the blanket, where no one could hear it, and let myself mean it. The wire caught and held, and for the first time, the light did not flicker. I'd spent 3 nights telling myself a real semiconductor was beyond me here. No clean materials, no tools fine enough, no way to cheat the physics, so I stopped chasing it. I took an empty glass bottle, a length of hand-drawn wire, and the fruit acid battery I'd already built, and I made the crude thing instead, a filament in a bottle, a steady orange glow with no flame behind it, no smoke, no smell. It wasn't elegant. A schoolchild could have drawn the diagram, but it sat there burning without eating the air, and I stood in my own workshop lit by something I'd made out of garbage, and I let myself feel it for exactly 1 breath before I got back to work. Then my chest gave a small hard squeeze, the kind the doctor had warned me about, and I set a hand flat on the bench until it passed. I told myself it was only the late hour. I told myself a lot of things that year. Word travels fast when it's worth money. Inside a week, the guild called me in. I set the bulb on their long table and turned it on. The men who'd once looked at me like a beggar with a gimmick went very quiet. One of them turned it in his hands, watching a glow that never guttered, and said it half to himself. Light with no fire, night shifts, workshops that don't burn down, a whole district that doesn't go up because someone kicked a lamp. It's sellable, was all I offered. 30 years behind a shop counter teaches you never to look surprised by your own price. They declared it an invention. Then they told me the reward wasn't coming from them. It was coming from the crown. The prime minister himself had sent a purse to the man who'd put a safe light in the kingdom's hands. 100 gold coins. 100 gold coins. A year before, the banks of another world had decided I was worth nothing and closed the book on me for good. Now a kingdom I'd been dumped into wanted to shake my hand. I kept my face flat and counted the purse like it happened to me every week. Inside, something old and bruised sat up and started paying attention. I didn't save a coin of it. Every last piece of that purse went straight back into the work. I hired 2 men that week, a blacksmith with burn-scarred forearms and a woodworker with a careful eye, and I put them on the least glamorous job in the building. Screws, nuts, washers. The small dull parts nothing gets built without. Accuracy, I told them, more than once. Above all else, accuracy. Without these, nothing you build holds together. They cast the parts rough and finished them by hand, filing the burrs off the threads under the bulb's steady light. It was slow, thankless, and exactly right. You don't build an empire on the flashy thing. You build it on the tool that makes the tool that makes the flashy thing. I improved the motor, steadied the battery, and started sketching the machine I really wanted underneath it all. The mother machine. The one that would cut every other machine into being. It was still just the beginning, and I knew it. It was also the first honest beginning I'd had in a long time. A year went by faster than any year I could remember. By the end of it, the place didn't look like a workshop anymore. It looked like a small town that happened to belong to me. Soap scent off one building, hammer ring off another. The light bulb shop with its own chimney. The orphanage field where the children grew vegetables and shouted at each other over nothing. More than 100 people drew wages under my name. And still, I did the thing that drove my accountant to despair. I gathered the grown vagrants off the streets, sat them down to a hot meal, and quietly worked out who I could use. I hired 5 of them that day, a cook who'd lost his restaurant to debt, a painter nobody bought anymore, a failed inventor who'd been sued for selling a hair tonic that grew nothing at all, a former lecturer with more grudges than teeth, and a doctor with shaking hands, and a bottle he couldn't put down, a man named Grant, who couldn't meet my eye when I offered him honest work. People asked why I collected the broken ones instead of the bright ones. The bright ones leave, I told them. They get a better offer and they're gone by spring. But a man the whole world already threw away, you give him a seat at the table and he stays. I knew that better than anyone in the room. I'd been the man in the gutter once, begging strangers for the price of bread. I didn't say that part out loud. The accountant was the one bright one who stayed, and she stayed because she'd decided the place was hers to save. Kate ran my books like a woman defusing a bomb. She dropped a ledger on my desk that evening and told me, in that flat, clipped way of hers, that my charity was going to sink me. Bread for vagrants, beds for orphans, wages for men who filed burrs. All of it noble, all of it bleeding money. At this size, she said, the company was barely afloat, and one bad season would put it under. Ideals don't run a company, she said, not unkindly. I told her the charity was an investment. She told me investments were supposed to show a return. Then she made me buy a mansion. I fought it and lost. Nobles and big merchants, she explained, weigh a man by his coat and his address before they hear a single word he says. And in my old overcoat, I looked like somebody's gardener. So I bought a used manor with a garden and a barn and rooms for staff, put on clothes that actually fit, and let her look me over like a horse she'd groomed for auction. Now you look like a proper president, she allowed. And then, in the same breath, with the exact same flat eyes, she told me I ought to take a wife, for status, for succession, and that if it came to it, she would marry me herself. I have talked my way out of hard rooms for 30 years. I did not have one single word ready for that. Kate wasn't the only one. I'd thrown a party at the new manor, food from a chef who'd once cooked for royalty, roses lit up all through the garden, my inventions passed hand to hand while I gave out soap and candles and watched my sales network double in one evening. It worked exactly the way Kate promised it would. It also handed me a second complication. Sarah, the guildmaster's daughter, came with her father's blessing and quiet intentions of her own. She was softer than Kate, warmer, tied to every door in the merchant world worth opening, and she made it plain her backing came with herself attached. Even if I never chose her, she said, she would support me anyway. Somehow, that was harder to turn down than a demand. When the last guest drifted off, the two of them cornered me from either side, each perfectly polite, neither giving an inch. I told them to stop, that the company came first, that it was the only thing that mattered right now. They both smiled and agreed that was a very elegant way to say nothing at all. Two women who could have run a kingdom between them. And there I stood in my own garden, wishing absurdly for the small, slow life I'd once pictured. A quiet shop, a quiet evening, nobody's whole future resting on my answer. Late that night, I stood at my study window and watched the orphanage lights across the field. The children were still awake, chasing each other down the vegetable rows, howling at some joke only they understood. On the desk behind me sat two papers, a new motor design and a marriage proposal, and I hadn't touched either one. I kept thinking of a wife and a son in a world I would never see again, and how sitting down to build a new family felt like closing the door on the old one before I was ready to. But the laughing outside pulled harder than the guilt inside. Whatever I decided about Kate, about Sarah, about my own quiet life, those children were going to have a future. That part wasn't a question. That part I already knew how to answer. Somewhere across the city, a polite man who had shaken my hand and toured my orphanage had already decided my company needed to disappear. I didn't know that yet. I only knew the children were laughing, and I turned off the lamp and let the dark settle. And it was the last easy night I'd have for a long while. Autumn came, and I was riding through town in a carriage, half watching the leaves run from green to gold to red, when I saw the legs, two thin legs, stretched out limp in the shadow of an alley, going nowhere. Every other person on the street had already walked straight past them. "Stop the carriage," I said, and I was down on the cobbles before the wheels had finished turning. He was a grown man, or had been one, a vagrant, starved down to almost nothing, barely warm to the touch. When I gathered him up, he weighed less than one of my orphans, and that was the thing that frightened me. A man that tall should have been heavy in my arms. He was light as a bundle of dry sticks, and before I'd carried him 3 steps, I already knew how far gone he was. "To Grant's clinic," I told the driver. "Fast as you can." Grant was drunk when we came through his door. He blinked at me from behind a bottle and started some slurred excuse about just one more drink first, and I had him sobered and on his feet before he finished the sentence. To his credit, the moment his hands touched the man, they steadied. Whatever else the drink had ruined in him, it hadn't taken the doctor out entirely. He looked the man over and told me the truth flat out. There was almost nothing left to hold on to. The hunger had already taken the rest. "Then we try anyway," I said. So he tried. I stood in that cramped front room and let him work, and I did not let myself think too hard about how quiet the back of the clinic had gone. There was no struggle to it at the end. No last words, nothing to fight, nothing to push back against. Just a stillness that spread out of the back room and filled the whole place. And then Grant stepped out, wiping his hands, and gave one small shake of his head. He reached to close the dead man's eyes. I stopped him, and I did it myself. I never even learned his name. All I knew was that he had starved to death in a town where I owned a soup kitchen, half a mile from more bread than he could have eaten in a year. I wish, I said, and my voice came out wrong. I could have given him even a bowl of soup. Nobody in the room had anything to answer to that. Outside the window, a single withered leaf let go of its branch and fell. We buried him 3 days later. They washed him and dressed him and laid him in a plain coffin, and my whole household came out to put a stranger in the ground. The orphans stood in a row, holding themselves very still. My workers came in their good clothes and said nothing at all. When the first soil struck the wood, it landed far louder than anything has a right to. Afterward, the priest came to me, kind-eyed, and told me not to blame myself. I hadn't abandoned the man, he said. The stranger had felt human warmth at the very end, and surely that was worth something. Then he warned me, gently, not to let my grief harden my heart. I thanked him. I left an offering. I meant none of it, because the priest had it backwards. Warmth at the end wasn't worth something, not measured against a bowl of soup a week earlier. To fail to save a man is to fail all the way, and nothing you feel afterward reaches back and undoes it. I rode home with the town sliding past the window like it belonged to some other man's life. That night, I gathered them in the courtyard. Every worker, every orphan, everyone who ate under my roof. I wanted witnesses. I told them the plain truth first. A man had starved to death in our town while I had money in the bank and a doctor on my payroll and a kitchen that handed out soup at the gate. All of that, and it still hadn't been enough because I hadn't seen him in time. Then I told them the rest of it. Years ago, long before any of this, I'd had a friend, a boy I grew up beside, hungry the same way we were all hungry back then. And one winter, he simply wasn't there anymore. He starved while I stood close enough to touch him, too small and too poor to do a single thing to stop it. I had carried that my whole life. I built all of this, every wall of it, so that I would never have to carry it a second time. And then I made them my promise, out loud, where I could never take it back. No one under this roof will ever be thrown away or left to starve. Not while I have breath in me and a coin to spend. Not one of you. Not ever. The children watched me with wide eyes. The grown men looked at the ground, and the thing in my chest that had been shaking since the alley went quiet and hard and certain, and it stayed that way. I didn't feel better for it. I felt aimed. Grant was waiting for me when I came by to thank him for trying. There was no bottle on his desk, only an empty one, set off to the side like something he was finished with. He told me he was quitting the drink. He hadn't been enjoying it anyway, he admitted. He'd only been hiding inside it. Then he confessed the thing that shamed him. He'd looked at that starving man and given up before he'd even started, drawn a line somewhere in his chest, and decided the stranger was already dead. He'd been doing it for years, he said, patient after patient, quitting on them quietly and then drinking himself past the guilt. And then a factory owner with no medical training whatsoever had grabbed him by the collar and refused to quit on a man he'd never met. And Grant couldn't stand what that made him look like. I'm nothing special, I told him. I just hate giving up. It's got nothing to do with whether they can be saved. The moment I quit, it's over. So I don't quit. He poured the last of the bottle out onto the floor. I made tea instead, and we drank it in a silence that felt like the start of something rather than the end of it. We talked through what the clinic needed: a clean room, herbs stocked deep, apprentices, water boiled before it touched a wound, because I told him another one would come. There were always more. He warned me, low, not to get greedy with it, or I'd break myself before I broke the problem. Then he let it go. This time, we would be ready. And then it got tested. Not long after, I carried in another one. A young man starved down nearly as thin as the first. But this time, Grant was sober and standing ready. The room was clean, the herbs were stocked, and he went to work without a drop in him. When he finally straightened up, he told me the man was holding on. Holding on. One man holding on. It doesn't sound like much when you say it out loud. After the alley, after the grave, after the promise I'd made in the dark of my own courtyard. That one word was everything I had asked the world for. The piston caught, and the whole iron frame shuddered once, and then began to turn, smooth and patient, on nothing but fire and boiled water. I stood back and watched the flywheel come up to speed. When the bulb I had wired off, it woke and held, steady and cool. I let myself grin like a boy who had gotten away with something. 2 years. That was how long it had taken me to go from a bottle and a hand-drawn coil to this, a working engine, turning under its own breath. It did not happen in a straight line. First came the mother machine, the one that made the parts that made the parts. Once I had that, everything else got easier. Screws that matched, gears that meshed, washers a man could stack 100 deep and never find a bad one. My blacksmith and my woodworker stopped filing burrs by hand and started building tools that built tools. The whole work sped up around them. The old lecturer helped more than I expected. He came in one morning with his arms full of stones, the way another man might bring flowers, and dumped a fortune of manganese and graphite and lithium ore across my bench. Better batteries. I told him plainly that a handful of pretty rocks was not a product, that I needed a steady supply, or none of it mattered. And the old academic in him woke right up. He agreed to go survey the hills for me. I kept the dangerous side of it close to my chest. Batteries can burn, can burst, can run away with themselves. And I had no wish to teach this world that lesson the hard way. By then the company had spread into a dozen little kingdoms under one roof. Soap, candles, the light shop, the orphanage, the research bench, the tooling floor. I even bought up an old painter's canvases, whole armfuls of them, and hung his sunsets down the mansion corridor and out across the factory walls, because a place where people worked ought to have something beautiful to look at. He took my price without a blink and went home humming to start another. I could have coasted. I did not, of course. I never do. I did not know it then. I only pieced it together long after, from the shape of what came next. 2 districts over, the polite man who ran the Sun House behind a velvet smile, the one they called Director Mercer in daylight and the broker in the dark, was being called to account. A bored, gilded noble had summoned him to complain that fewer children were reaching him than before, that the ones who did came thin and poor, and the broker had to stand there and explain why. Me, or rather, my little inventions. The cloth packets of ash and ground mustard that blind a grown man for a good while if they hit his face. The tubes that shriek loud enough to turn every head on a street. The bladders of foul liquid no one can stomach coming near. I had put them into the hands of every street child in the North for free, and told them to run and make noise. His hunters had been coming back empty for weeks. The noble waved the trouble off the way rich men wave off anything that costs them nothing. Find another way. Keep the children coming. And the broker bowed low and swallowed it, and behind his lowered eyes, a cold black thing was doing arithmetic. If the North had grown teeth, he would hunt where the sheep were still soft. The South, the East, other towns entirely, where no strange old man was arming the poor. He was patient. That was the part I would learn to fear. He did not rage and lash out. He simply moved his ledger to a fresh page and kept it open. I was busy hanging paintings. The second anniversary festival was my idea, and I threw myself into the part of it no one expected, the cooking. The food in this world was fine enough, but it was missing everything I missed. So I tied on an apron and made my own crooked versions of home. Flatbread with cheese and cured meat baked on top. Ground beef pressed into patties and seared. Long fried potatoes, salted hot. Chicken dredged and dropped in oil until it crackled. I had no soy sauce and no proper ketchup, so half my old menu was hopeless. But what I could make, I piled high. The children swarmed the tables and called me a genius with their mouths full. I told them it was all imitation. Every plate of it, a thing that only looked like the real one. My head chef drifted past, chewing slowly, and gave the whole afternoon its highest honor. Not bad, he allowed, and moved on before I could thank him. Then the orphans sang. Their choir cracked on the high notes and trembled on the low ones, and did not keep together for more than a bar at a time. And it was the best thing I had heard in years. Well done, I told them, and watched their faces open like windows. They put on a little play after, and one small boy forgot every word he had, froze solid, and had to be walked gently off stage by 2 others. And the whole yard laughed, not at him, with him, the warm kind of laugh that pulls a room together. The neighbors leaned over the fence to watch, and I waved them in. They came shy and left stuffed, promising to come back and buy something tomorrow just to square the debt. Somebody found a fiddle. People danced who had no business dancing in the same square. A rich man's wife next to a soup line boy, a guard next to a grandmother, and nobody minded. Long after the music died, I stood alone in the yard and looked at the sleeping factory. 2 years ago, this had been an empty shell and a debt I could not name. Now children were asleep on benches, and a couple of drunk old men snored against the wall, and the whole place smelled of bread and smoke and people. This is the best time, I said to no one, and meant it more than I had meant anything in a long while. The next morning, a line of strangers had already formed at the gate. Word of the festival had run through the whole North District overnight, and half the town came to see the odd company that fed its neighbors for free. The candles and soap went out the door faster than we could stack them, and the ones who had eaten my food the day before came back to buy, the way they said they would. I put my hat on and went to work light on my feet, and told myself I had earned this one. Then summer came, and I did the thing I always do. It started with me announcing a long break for the whole company, which froze the factory solid. The president does not rest. The president never rests. So surely something had gone wrong. Nothing had. I had simply decided to spend the quiet season chasing money, all of it at once, for a school. That was the dream I had not told anyone. Not just reading in sums for the orphans, but real teaching, trade, craft, manners. The kind of pride that keeps a poor child from ever thinking of himself as inventory. I wanted the whole building at once. Good teachers hired all together, not raised a brick a year. So I ran deal after deal through the hottest weeks. Careful at first, banking small safe wins. Kate watched the numbers climb and told me it was enough. If we stop here, we've done well, she said, ledger against her hip, in the flat voice she used for facts. Sarah, gentler, put a hand on the doorframe. You could build it little by little, Walter. There's no shame in slow. I would not hear it. I poured everything I had built onto one ambitious deal, and in the heat, worn thin, I misjudged it, and it fell through my hands. I stood a long moment in the sun and then gave a small tired laugh. Not so easy after all. I came home in the carriage with my hat crushed in my fists, and the heat and the months of hiding how hard I had driven myself all landed on me at once. I went to bed for a week. Once, in the dark, a thin squeeze closed around my chest and let go, and I chose not to think about it. Kate changed the cool cloth on my head and told me she had warned me. Sarah brought water and said next time we would go to the sea instead of chasing another deal. The two of them fussed and scolded over me in turns, and out in the hall, the orphans giggled to hear their unshakable president being told off like anyone's tired father. Let them. They thought it was only the summer heat, the way it took me every year. I let the half of it that was true stand for the whole, and told the ceiling I would manage the school next year. Autumn put me back on my feet, and on my first real day off a carriage I did not recognize rolled up my drive and stopped. It was a noble's carriage, lacquered, matched horses, a crest on the door. I stood on the step, trying to think which lord I had forgotten I owed a visit, and then the door opened and a young lady stepped down. She was perhaps 12 or 13, in a good pale dress, her hair pinned like a girl raised to it. She did not wait for a servant to announce her. She looked straight at me across the whole drive, the way almost no one looks at a stranger, like she had found the thing she had come a long way to find. We sat across a small table, and a maid poured tea, and I searched her face and came up with nothing. "Do you remember me?" she asked. I did not. I turned her over in my mind and found no shelf she fit on. "Forgive me," I said. "I have a poor memory for faces. Where have we met?" She did not seem hurt. She set her cup down with both careful hands and told me, plainly, as if reciting something she had held close for a long time. "Back then, when I was hungry," she said, "you gave me a silver coin, and the floor of 2 years fell away under me. I remembered a road. I remembered a market where a pen had just sold for a small fortune and a thin, ragged child crying somewhere behind me and telling myself I had earned the right to keep walking. I had not kept walking. I had turned around and pressed one silver coin into a filthy little hand and thought no more about it, because to me, it had been nothing, less than nothing, a coin I would not miss by nightfall. She had not forgotten it for a single day. "My name is Lily," she said. "The Count and Countess Ashby took me in. They have no children of their own." She folded her hands. "After you, various things happened. I lost. I had already lost my parents. The hunters nearly took me, but that coin bought me one more night, and then one more. And somewhere in there, a kind house found me. I have been looking for you ever since. I only wanted to say it to your face." She lifted her eyes, and they were steady, older than her years. "Thank you for helping me. I am not a man who cries easily." I sat there with a lump in my throat like a stone and let her tell me the rest. The losing, the running, the childless count who chose her. And the whole time I kept thinking one useless, wondering thing. One coin I would not have missed, thrown once onto a road. And here it came back to me across 2 years, wearing a good dress and calling me by my trade. When her carriage pulled away, I stood in the drive a long while after it was gone. I had told my whole household, over a grave, that no one under my roof would ever be thrown away or left to starve. I had said it because a boy I loved once starved beside me when we were small and I could do nothing. And here was the plain proof, driving off down my own lane, that the smallest thing a man does can outlive him. It steadied something in me that the failed summer had knocked loose. Not everyone who came to my gate came in gratitude. Some came to rob me. What happened to the last one who tried is still my favorite story. His name was Barnaby, and he ran a rival house that had spent 2 years copying my candles and my soap a week behind me and hating me for it. He decided the only way to catch up was to steal whatever secret I was hiding. So one night, he blacked his clothes, smeared soot on his face, tangled his beard, and crept over my wall dressed as a beggar to spy out the workshop. He got about 10 steps before Ken, one of my candle boys, found him in the dark and beamed at him. "Are you here for work, mister?" the boy asked. Because at my company, a stranger in the yard was always someone who needed a job. Before Barnaby could invent a lie, he had a ladle shoved into his hand and was set to stirring the great cauldron. And here is the thing, he was good. His merchant's hands knew heat and thickness without being told. He stirred that vat like a master and cursed himself the whole time for it. I came through on my rounds, watched a filthy beggar work my materials better than half my paid men, and could not help myself. "That is a beautiful way to stir," I told him. "Show me the rest." I ran him through 3 more tasks, and he passed everyone, sweating and furious under his soot. So I offered him the job. "You've a real talent. Come in tomorrow at 9 in the morning." I have never seen a man leave a building so fast. I did think, watching him bolt over the wall, that I had seen that face somewhere before. He did not come in at 9, of course. He went home and sat alone and stewed, sure I had seen through him, telling himself over and over that he had escaped clean. Then, because a merchant's curiosity never sleeps, he took a screwdriver to one of my little self-moving toys, the kind children begged for at my shop, that spun and rolled on their own. He wanted to know the trick. He pulled the motor, the gears, the small battery, laid them out neat, and understood them well enough. And then, deep in the thing, a tiny bulb lit up in his hand, light with no flame, no wick, no fire at all, buried inside a child's toy for the sheer joy of it. I heard later that he sat back from his desk and went very quiet, that he stopped calling me his rival that night and started calling me something else. A true genius, he said to the empty room, that a shady little copy house like his had blundered, without meaning to, into the orbit of a real one, and that all a man like him could do was stand and look up at the world a man like me could build. He was not wrong to be awed. He just had the wrong idea about the magic. There was no magic. There was only a tired man who knew things this world had not learned yet. The house I had built ran on more than my hands now, and that was the part that still surprised me. Karen ran the orphanage floor. She was a widow past 40 who had lost her shop and her husband in the same bad year and been turned away from every door in town for the crime of being alone, until I gave her the job. She complained without stopping and cared without stopping, and never once noticed the two were the same thing. I walked in that afternoon with another small stray asleep against my shoulder. One more I had found in a gutter and could not leave, and Karen took one look and sighed all the way down to her boots. "Boss, another one?" She was already reaching for the towel. Yes, same as always. Leave the rest to me." And she carried the child off to be bathed and fed and put in a bed, grumbling every step, gentle as anything with the towel. At the gate stood two young men the Merchant Association had sent to guard me, a pair called Miller and Cameron. They had taken me for a plain, soft-headed old man at first, a fool who gave nearly all his money to orphans and kept almost none for himself, the sort, one of them thought, who tends to die young. Then they learned what the money went to. Both of them had been orphans once. They looked at the soup line and the little beds and quietly decided that a man like me was exactly the sort the world could not afford to lose, and that they would stand between me and it, whether I paid them enough or not. So there it was, the whole of it, running warm and full, the engine turning, the coin come home, a rival converted to an admirer, a widow scolding my strays into clean beds, two orphans grown into my shield at the gate, every fire I owned burning bright at once. I told myself again that I had earned it. Somewhere to the south, a patient man was turning to a fresh page in his ledger, and he had already written my name at the top. The lathe caught, and for half a second, the whole workshop held its breath. Then the cutting head bit into a bar of iron and peeled a curl of bright metal off it, clean as a ribbon, and somebody shouted, and the shout turned into a cheer that rattled the rafters. I had waited a long time for that sound. A lathe is nothing to look at. A frame, a spinning shaft, a blade you crank slowly into the work. But it is the tool that makes tools. And until you have one, every screw and every rod is filed by hand, and no two of them ever match. Now I could cut the same part twice and have them come out the same. That was the whole game, right there in one curl of scrap on the floor. The blacksmith wiped his hands on his apron and pretended he hadn't been sweating over it for a month. I clapped him on the shoulder anyway. "You," I told him, "are worth every coin I don't pay you fast enough," he grunted, which from him was a speech. The woodworker beside him had shaped the guide beds so true you could set a cup on them and it wouldn't roll. I told him so, and watched the tips of his ears go red. Then I said the thing I'd been saving. Next, we build the mother machine, a machine whose only job is to make other machines' parts. Screws, nuts, bolts, all of them to one standard, so any part fits any other part in the city. I let that sit. After that, we don't build things one at a time anymore. We build them by the hundred. Nobody in this world had ever heard the idea, and half of them didn't fully understand it, but they heard the certainty in it. The room went loud again. Small improvements, stacked one on the next, quietly become a revolution while nobody's watching. I had spent 30 years learning that on the other side of a door, I could never open again. Here, it was still true. I told myself I had earned the right to feel good about it. The young ones who ran the soap and candle benches were good with their hands and useless with their heads. And that was my fault, not theirs. I'd spent 2 years doing all their thinking for them. So one afternoon, I gathered them, stood there with my arms folded until they went nervous, and finally said, "I want you to make something new. Yours, not mine. Go." They looked at each other like I'd asked them to fly. For days, they whispered and argued. One of them muttered, low, that the only way to pay me back was to take work off my shoulders, that they'd spent 2 years just doing what they were told, and it was time to make a company that could run without me. I heard it and said nothing. That mutter was worth more than any product. Then the samples appeared on the bench. A soap scented sweet as an orchard. A soap shaped and colored like a candy. Little decorations pressed into its face. A candle with fine powder worked into the wax, so the flame threw a soft shimmer across the wall. The craft was rough. The ideas were not. The eye behind these is good, I told them. Now go use them. Give them to people. Watch which hand reaches out and which one doesn't. That's where the real work starts. They improved them. They set them out for sale. Nobody bought. The workshop went heavy. They came to me with their heads down, and one of them asked the question they'd been circling all week. "Boss, what do we have to do to make it sell?" Every part of me wanted to just tell them. I knew the answer. I'd known it for 30 years. I stood there with my fists closed at my sides and my mouth shut, because a man handed the answer learns nothing, and I didn't need hands. I needed people who could think. Wrong question, I said at last. Don't ask me how to sell it. Go find out why it isn't selling. Think, then think again. Then think it through until the day it sells. I braced for the slumped shoulders. Instead, their eyes lit, all of them, at once, like lamps. They nodded and went back to the bench arguing, and I made myself walk away before I could ruin it by helping. A soccer coach told me once that teaching is the easy part. The hard part is standing on the line with your mouth shut, letting them lose, so that one day they win something that's actually theirs. There was a boy who never left. Chestnut hair, thin, quiet as a shadow, one of the orphanage children. Wherever I worked, I'd look up and find him a few feet off, watching my hands with a focus that most grown men can't hold for a minute. He didn't beg for attention. He just watched, the way I used to watch machines when I was his age and hungry. One evening, he was staring at the little steam engine model on the bench, the toy version, an alcohol lamp under a water tank, steam nudging a piston in slow puffs. You like it? I asked him. Yes. The single word came out fast and bright, the first thing I'd ever heard him say with feeling. Good eyes. I thought he had good eyes. I know the look because I've spent my whole life owning it, so I started letting him help. Small things at first. Hand me that. Hold this steady. Watch what happens when I open the valve. He soaked it up without a wasted motion. Around then, we were building something bigger. A prototype of a self-moving cart, a steam vehicle, the engine mounted on a frame meant to carry itself. One afternoon, we had it half assembled, parts still scattered, and Karen called me off to deal with some crisis at the orphanage. I left Toby sitting there among the pieces. I was gone the better part of an hour. When I came back, the cart was finished. Not started. Finished. The linkages set, the pipe seated, the wheels squared. Every step I hadn't shown him yet. Done clean. Because he had watched me do the ones before and simply reasoned out the rest. I stood in the doorway a moment. Then, did you do this? He nodded, just nodded, and looked at me to see if he was in trouble. I laughed, and it surprised us both. Boy, I said, you're going to be dangerous someday. I put him on the development team that hour, the youngest apprentice I had. His name was Toby, and I meant to give him everything I knew before I ran out of it. That was the house I'd built, full and fed, and better with tools than any factory in Brightwater. I told myself, again, that I had earned it. I hadn't the faintest idea what was already being written down about me in a room I would never be invited into. Once a month, I put every department in one room. The cargo men, the bookkeepers, the cooks, the smiths, the guards. That night, the hall was quieter than usual, and I stood on the low stage with my arms crossed and my eyes on the floorboards. And for a long moment, I couldn't make myself start. Then, I told them a thing I almost never tell anyone. When I was small, I said, everybody around me was poor. You worked all day and still couldn't fill a plate. I had a friend back then, missing a front tooth, made the stupidest face when he laughed. The lamp above me gave a small pop in the silence. He died. Malnutrition. Just went hungry until there wasn't anything left of him. I made myself keep going. I've thought about it my whole life. If I'd given him half of what I had, just half, every day, maybe he doesn't die. Maybe he's an old man somewhere right now. I'll never know because I didn't. Nobody moved. 100 faces, and not one of them looking away. That's why I can't walk past a starving man in an alley. Not can't afford to. Can't. Something in me won't let my legs keep going. I finally looked up at them. I'm not asking you to save everyone. You can't. There are thousands out there and we are one company. But when the chance is right in front of you, when it's one person, one bowl, one night, help them. That's all. Help the one you can reach. For a moment there was nothing. Then a man stood in the middle rows and said, rough. If you hadn't picked me up, boss, I'd be frozen in a ditch. Another. My family lived through winter on your account. A third just said my name and couldn't finish. I waved it all down. You're making too much of it, I muttered, and ended the meeting because if I stayed up there another minute, I was going to embarrass myself. I heard, much later, what one man had been thinking in the back of that hall. He'd nodded along with the rest and clapped when the rest clapped. And underneath it, he'd been doing arithmetic. Thousands of dying strangers, one company already stretched thin, and thinking, quietly, that a saint who can't stop giving will bury everyone standing behind him. He didn't say it. That was the whole trouble. None of them who felt it ever said it to me. I need to tell you about a room I was never in. On a night I don't remember, because you should see the knife before I did. The broker had tried to beat me the ordinary way and failed. My cheap little street defenses had choked his hunters. My name had grown too clean to touch in the open. So he sat with his ledgers and decided he would stop fighting the house from outside. He would break it from inside instead. Faster, he reasoned, and far less blood on his own hands. A house is easiest to bring down from within. He sent quiet men to learn everything about my company. They came back with a full account, and every line of it was true. They told him I poured money into orphans, the orphanage, the kitchens, schooling for children who'd never held a book. He found that funny. A rich man's toy, he called it. A fool spending his fortune on inventory that would never pay him back. They told him the whole operation stood on two people. Sarah, my secretary, whose father sat with the Merchant Association and could open any door in the city. Kate, my accountant, who knew where every coin of mine slept at night. Strong pillars, both. He noted them and moved on, because you don't knock down a house by pushing on its strongest beams. Then his man read out one more name, a section chief, a former salesman from a rival house, still drowning in an old debt to that rival's president, a debt he could not climb out of no matter how hard he worked, and who quietly hated all the money his new master threw at beggars. The broker went still at the word debt. A debt to a man like him is a leash already fastened around someone's throat. He didn't need to make the weakness. It was there, waiting, wearing a company uniform and eating at my table. He set his plan around that one man, poured himself a drink, and asked the empty room how much longer I thought I was going to keep smiling. The name was Nolan. He was my sales chief, and I trusted him without a second's thought. Before any of that reached me, Nolan was already talking. Not to the broker. The broker was patient and hadn't touched him yet. Just to three men over cheap drink in a corner, saying out loud the thing the whole company was starting to feel. He slammed his cup down hard enough to slop it. "The man's a saint," he said, and he did not mean it kindly. A saint. And a saint is going to drown every last one of us. The three across from him said nothing. You remember what the North District used to look like. Bodies in every doorway. Fine, feed them. But you start a charity for that, you don't put it on the company's books. He's carrying the whole rotting weight of this city on our ledger and calling it business. He drank. He got quieter and worse. You know what he did for me? I stole from him, from the warehouse. Caught cold, should have been thrown in the street. And he looks at me and says, "Don't do it again, work the debt off in sales." Nolan's mouth twisted. So I owe him my life. Fine, I've heard it 1,000 times, but now he's dragging in the ones who can't even stand, buying them doctors, medicine, food, men who'll never lift a finger for the company. Not one of us four got saved from dying. You notice that? We got saved because we could still work. That was a business. This is bleeding. One of the three flinched at that and looked at the table and said nothing, because agreeing out loud could get back to me and be called disloyalty. They were all former beggars I'd taken in. They were more afraid of losing this than they were honest with each other. "I've got a wife," Nolan said, low. "A kid. I owe him my life, sure, but I owe them a roof too, and I can't pay 2 debts with 1 purse." He stared into his cup. I just wish once he'd think about himself, about us, before there's nothing left to give away. Then he went home to his family. And I want you to understand, he wasn't a villain yet. He was a frightened man saying a frightened thing in a dark room. But under the company floor, where all our numbers still climbed and every window still glowed, the first hairline cracks were already running quietly through the stone. And a patient man across the city now knew exactly where they were. At the end of every day, the same thing happened, and it looked worse than it was. The books closed, the warehouse doors came down, the lamps went out one by one, and my carriage waited at the gate. I climbed in. Kate followed with her ledger under one arm. Sarah followed her. 2 young women, both of them clever enough to frighten a room, going home in the same carriage as the boss, every single night. I knew exactly how it looked. I called them my 2 troublesome daughters in the privacy of my own skull, and made silent apologies to a wife I no longer had, and told myself it was a work. It was an escort. It was a business meeting on wheels. It was, in fact, exactly that. Because the moment the door shut, the romance drained out of it entirely. "If the charity stays at this level," Kate said, flat, not looking up from a column of figures, "we're in deficit inside 3 months. Sarah was already halfway to a fix. "Then we don't cut it," she said. "We find it somewhere else. My father's people, a patron, a loan against next year. Numbers, schedules, the price of medicine." That was the whole scandal in the carriage. A company 3 months from bleeding red, and 2 women trying to keep it alive. The men at the gate did not hear any of that. They only saw what I saw from the outside once. An old man riding off into the dusk with 2 beauties, night after night. I heard how it went later. They'd drink and they'd laugh. And the laughing had a bad edge on it. Lucky old man, has the women and the money both, calls himself a giver, and keeps the best of everything for himself. Men I had pulled out of the snow, saying it about me over cups I had paid for. By morning, the joke had hardened into something they told each other as fact. I didn't hear a word of it. I was busy being happy. The lathe was cutting true. The boys were learning to think. Toby was better than me already. And I had said the one thing over my whole life out loud to a room that loved me for it. I told myself, one more time, that I had earned all of it. I was about to leave the city for a while, and I would leave it exactly like this. The house at its strongest, and the knife already chosen, already inside, already waiting for the door to close behind me. The women had rules that night. No ledgers at dinner, no talk of the factory, and no slipping off to the study once the plates were cleared. I should have known a company was being formed the moment they agreed on the terms in front of me. We moved to the room with the fireplace. Kate poured the tea like she was reading out a verdict. Sarah took the chair between me and the door. Then they said it together, in the same breath, as if they had rehearsed it. It was time I chose a wife. I did what any sensible man does when he is cornered by his own accountant. I tried to leave. I did not make it 2 steps. Sarah caught one arm, Kate caught the other, and somehow, all 3 of us went down onto the rug in a heap, with me flat on my back underneath the both of them, and my dignity somewhere across the room. "You really want this?" I asked the ceiling. A middle-aged man, gray coming in, a bad heart, and worse hours. "Yes," Kate said, and did not move an inch. Sarah only laughed. The whole answer, no words to it. So I reached for the last weapon I had. I told them, in my roughest voice, that if they did not let go this instant, I would attack them. Both of them, right here. I meant it as a threat. It landed as a proposal, because in the dialect of this city, that word, attack, is what a man says when he loves someone enough to want to close the last of the distance. It is how you ask for a marriage. I had just asked for 2. Sarah's face lit up. Kate was already talking property division, and which morning the association head kept his office open. I lay there and let it happen, the way you let the tide come in over your boots. It was, I decided, not the worst ambush I had ever lost. Out past the tall window, beyond the firelight on the glass, something shifted in the dark and was gone. I did not see it. I want you to know that someone was out there, that even at the happiest table I had ever sat down to, a shadow stood in the cold doing its arithmetic. By morning, the whole company knew, because Sarah had made certain of it before I finished my coffee. I stood up in the main hall and told them plainly, I was going to marry the two of them, properly, at Lumen Church. For one heartbeat, nobody moved. Then, the room came apart at the seams. Half of them cheered. A knot of the younger girls, the ones we had pulled off the street 2 years back, went loud and sour at once, insisting to anyone who would listen that they had called first, that they had meant to grow up and marry the boss themselves, and that these two had been circling from the very start. Congratulations. Envy, teasing, all of it in the same breath. A man clapped me on the shoulder hard enough to bruise and told me I was worth every coin. I did not feel worth much of anything. I felt cornered, and under the cornered feeling, quietly glad. In the corner, Nolan did not cheer. He nursed a cup he should not have had at that hour and muttered something about stability, about how a house looks strongest right before the wind finds the loose board. I heard it and I let it go by. I was a busy man being congratulated. I had no ear that morning for the one true thing said in the room, and under the noise, the other thing started. Never to my face. It never is. Quiet talk, the kind that travels desk to desk, that the marriage was a maneuver, that I had bought the guild with a pair of rings, that a man who weds his secretary and his accountant in a single stroke is managing his connections, not loving anyone. By evening, it had hardened into the shape of a fact. I would pay for that talk later. I simply did not know the bill was already being written. Lumen Church married the three of us on a bright morning under windows the color of cut jewels. I will not pretend I remember the words. I remember Kate's hand, steady as a spirit level. I remember Sarah crying without making a sound. And I remember the strange arithmetic of standing up in front of a whole city as a man with 2 wives and no apology in him for it. Sarah's father sat in the front row. He holds a seat on the Merchant Association, and his blessing tied my house to the guild in a knot no rival could cut cheaply. Kate had already worked out to the copper what that knot was worth to the company. Whatever else they were, my wives were the 2 finest allies a merchant could ever marry. Afterward, there was a fixed monthly allowance, set by the woman who now held my money, and I signed for it like a boy taking his lunch coins across a counter. Not bad, I thought, watching the two of them laugh in the church light. For a man who had once slept under a battered hat and a borrowed blanket, not bad at all. There is a thing every storyteller knows that every happy man forgets. The peak is where the ground is thinnest. I had climbed all the way up to it, and I was standing there in the sun with both hands full, and I never once looked down. The honeymoon was my idea, which surprised everyone, including me. There was an inventor rising in the Ainsworth Empire, a man I had a private reason to want to meet, and I told my wives I meant to go and shake his hand. Sarah heard the word honeymoon before I finished the sentence. Kate heard neighboring country and started counting guards. Inside a week, we had passports. I was oddly moved that a world could hand papers to a man who had dropped into it out of nowhere, and a carriage pointed at the coast. We did not make the first ship. We did not make it because of me. Twice on the road, we passed someone worse off than we were, an old man folded against a milestone, gone gray with sickness. No coin in him for a doctor. Both times I stopped the carriage. Both times I put gold into a stranger's hand and told him to go find help. Kate watched me do it and said nothing, which from Kate is an entire speech. The stops cost us the boat. We took rooms at a portside inn to wait for the next one, and I lay awake doing the sum I always come back to. I had been a beggar in this world once, with nothing to my name but a face no one had any reason to trust. What I built after that was not really soap or candles or light. It was credit, the willingness of strangers to believe I would do the thing I said I would do. That is heavier than gold and far slower to earn, and I had spent years earning it. Sitting in that inn, rich and married and idle, I told myself it was the one thing that could never be taken from me by any hand but my own. I was wrong about that, but the sea was calm, and a wife was asleep against my shoulder, and for one night, I let myself believe it. The crossing took 7 days, and my wives spent all 7 of them curing me of work. I am not built for a deck chair. By the second morning, I had the ship half taken apart in my head, the way it sat in the water, the count of the crew, the trick of catching wind and turning it into distance. By the third, I had thought up a machine that could catch a voice on a spinning disc and give it back to the room, and I had my notebook open and my pen moving before I remembered I was on my honeymoon. Kate took the notebook out of my hands without a word. She did not scold. She simply closed it, held it against her chest, and looked at me until I sat back down. "You promised," she said. Sarah leaned on the rail with the wind full in her face and told me she liked me better idle, that a lazy husband was the only proof she had that I trusted anyone in the world besides myself. Then, softer, the thing I have kept. "We are happy, aren't we?" "We were." I said so. and I meant every letter of it. And still, up on that bright deck, a wife on each arm, and not one thing in the world required of me, I could not set down the small cold weight in my chest. It was only worry. The company was fine. My people were good. The books were Kate's. The doors were Sarah's father's. The tools were watched. I told myself the feeling was just an old man who had never once learned how to rest. I have turned that feeling over many times since. It was the one part of me that was awake. Somewhere far behind us, across all that calm water, a door had been left unlocked by my leaving. And the only thing in me that knew it was a weight I kept telling myself to ignore. The inventor's house was not a house. It was a 4-story manor behind an iron gate, with a garden a man could lose an hour in. The kind of place an empire gives you when it decides you are worth keeping. We showed our letter at the gate and rode up the long drive, and the man who came down the steps to meet us was someone I already knew. I had last seen him on the other side of everything, a quiet former subordinate of mine, a tinkerer, the one whose half-finished machine had sat abandoned in my emptied warehouse. The machine that hummed itself to life the night I lost my first company and tore me across into this world. He had chased the same fault in the same device, and it had thrown him into this empire, where they scouted the strange genius who fell out of nowhere and paid him in mansions for his talking wires and his self-moving carriages. "Long time no see, boss," he said, and grinned like the years between us had never happened. "So it was you," I told him. "After all this time, you." I had built a whole life out of cursing that machine and blessing it in the same breath, and here stood the boy who made it, Ethan, alive, rich, safe, and somehow the husband of half a dozen wives, which made my two feel almost modest. We took tea in a room bigger than my first factory. He owed me nothing, and I owed him nothing, and neither of us said any of that out loud. We only talked, two men from a world of talking wires sitting in one that finally had them because of us. When we rose to leave, we swore to write, to keep a line open across the water between his empire and my kingdom. I made that promise kindly. I did not know I had just handed the one man alive who trusted me, without a shred of doubt, a thread that other hands would use to open my safe. The trip home came apart the way the trip out had. A storm shut the port and canceled every ship, and we lost a full week to it. A week I spent walking the empire, its castle, and its cathedral, and a legendary sword some dead hero had left buried to the hilt in a stone wall. Then, almost home, a landslide swallowed the road and held us again. 20 days, I had promised Kate. 20 days there and back. It became a full month. I did not count those days as a warning. I counted them as an inconvenience. Every single one of them was a day my company bled with no way on earth to reach me. Now I have to tell you about a month I did not live. The one that was happening behind my back while I stood on decks and drank tea in a stranger's palace. I have put it together since, out of ledgers and confessions and wreckage. This is where it happened. I'm in a house I was 1,000 miles from. The hand that had failed to beat me in the open had spent that whole time learning my house from the inside. It had passed over Kate, who knew where every coin slept. It had passed over Sarah, whose father was the guild itself. It had gone looking for the softest board in the floor, and it had found Nolan. You already know Nolan, my sales chief, the man I once caught with his hand in my own warehouse and forgave on a single promise. The debt he still carried to his old master had never been paid, only buried, and a quiet visitor came and dug it up and set it on the table in front of him with a simple price. There was a wife, there was a child. I never heard the words that were used on him, and I do not need to. A frightened man does not need many. So while I was a month and an ocean away, past the reach of any letter, Nolan did the thing he had been bought to do. Bills that should have been honored came due, and were left to bounce. The safe that held the company's ready silver was opened from the inside and emptied down to the lining. And into that empty space rushed the one thing faster than money, a story. That the old fool had finally shown his true face. That he had run off across the sea with 2 women and every coin his workers had ever earned, and left them holding a dead company and a ruined name. Suppliers who had trusted me for years read that story and stopped their carts. A bank that had never once doubted me shut its doors in the faces of my clerks. My credit, the very thing I had told myself in that inn no hand could take, came apart in a week, because the man they had taken it from was not there to look anyone in the eye and call it a lie. That is the whole cruelty of the design. It never needed to beat me. It only needed me gone. And I had taken myself away cheerfully, with a new ring on my hand. And here is the part that turned my stomach when I finally understood it, and turns it still. I had thought I was fighting a rival, a jealous trading house, a coward with a grudge and a fatter purse, someone with a name and a face, someone a man could one day stand in front of and finish. That is what I had braced myself for all along. That was not what this was. The man who had reached into my house and pulled Nolan's string did not run a rival company. He ran a network, a quiet patient web of debts and orphanages and favors that ran under the whole city, and, I would learn, a long way past it. The rival house was only one mouth of the thing. The missing children I had been quietly costing him for 2 years were another. He did not fight in the open because he did not have to. He owned pieces of the open, and the whole of it was built for one purpose beyond the money, to strike and then to vanish. leaving some smaller, stupider man holding the blame in the square while he walked away clean. I had been at war with a shadow, and I had mistaken it for a man. That was the question that woke while I stood out at sea, and it has not closed since. Not who wanted me ruined. I would learn that soon enough and drag those hands out into the light myself. The larger question, the one that outlived every other, the hand behind the hand, the one built never to be caught. I did not even know yet that it had a name. I only knew the moment I saw the true size of it, that beating the men in front of me would not be the end of anything. It would barely be the start. I knew none of it. On the last evening of the crossing home, I stood at the rail with Kate on one side and Sarah on the other, the sun going down gold on the water, the coast of my kingdom a thin, dark line growing ahead. I was thinking about the machine that catches a voice. I was thinking about the school I still meant to build for the orphans. I was, for the first time in 30 years, a man with nothing pressing to carry, and I did not tell myself I had earned it. I just had it, and it was enough. Sarah asked what I was smiling about. Nothing, I told her. Everything. The line of the coast rose as we came in. My city, my house, my 100 people, my whole life, all of it waiting for me past that darkening shore, and all of it already gone, and me still smiling, sailing home to the ashes as fast as the wind could carry me. The wind carried us home a day early, and I stepped off the ship still smiling, a crate of gifts under one arm, and both my wives laughing on the gangway behind me. I walked up from the harbor the way I had 100 times before. Then I turned the last corner onto my own street, and the smile came off my face like something wiped away. The yard was empty, not quiet, empty. No carts at the loading dock, no smoke off the works, no foreman's voice counting crates. The big gate I had built to stand open all day stood shut, and a paper had been nailed to the wood at eye height. I set the crate down in the road and read it twice before the words would hold still. My house was in default. The accounts were frozen, by order. A neighbor I had known for 2 years crossed to the far side of the street rather than past me. A woman pulled her boy indoors by his collar, and I heard the word before I understood it was about me, that the old man had run off overseas with 2 women and the workers' wages, and left the rest to burn. I had been gone 1 month, and there was nothing left to come home to. Inside was worse than the street. The office had been turned over, the ledgers dragged from their shelves, the warehouse doors hanging open on their hinges, raw stock, finished goods, the cash box, all of it gone, carried off in the panic by people who had decided I was never coming back and helped themselves on the way out. Kate met me in the back room and put her hand flat on the cold iron of the open safe. It stood empty. The balance was there, she said. I checked it myself the morning we left. The bank's message was short, and it did not care about my feelings. 300 gold coins had come due, and there had been nothing in the accounts to cover them. Frozen, then drained in that order, which was its own kind of confession, though I was too gutted to hear it yet. My partner Barrett had waited on that payment with no way to reach me for a month, and when it failed, his patience was finished, so I paid him. I went to my own strongbox. The private savings 30 years of caution had taught me to keep apart from the company, and I emptied it to the last coin to cover the 300. And I told him from the bottom of whatever was left of me that I was sorry. He took it. He even softened. But a paid debt does not unring a bell, and the whole city had already decided who I was. It was my butler who could barely make himself say the rest. The rumor that I had fled had not started with a stranger. It had started with one of our own, my sales chief, Nolan, the man I had caught in a theft years ago and forgiven and kept and trusted with the money. The man who had muttered into his cups in taverns for months. I got as far as asking my wives if they knew how the account had run dry. They said they didn't, and that was the last thing I heard clearly, because the floor tilted under me, and a fist I hadn't known was in my chest closed hard, and the whole room went out like a snuffed lamp. Overwork, the doctor said when I finally came back to myself. Overwork, and a heart gone weak underneath it. He said it kindly, the way you tell a man a thing his own body has been trying to tell him for years. I stayed in that bed 3 days. There was nothing to get up for. No ledgers, no payroll, no creditor at the door to shout at. And somehow the silence was the worst of all of it. I lay and I looked at the ceiling. There were knots in the wood up there, and after enough hours, they arranged themselves into faces, and every one of them seemed to be laughing at me. Out the window, the sky was blue. Stupidly, insultingly blue. The kind of blue that has never had one hard day in its life. And under everything, one word, going round and round like a wheel that wouldn't catch. Why? Why couldn't I cover 300 gold coins? Why was the safe empty when I had left it full? Why did they believe I would run? I, who had never run from anything. I wrote them a letter. I did. And a storm ate the days. And by the time I stepped off that ship, the letter did not matter, because a lie travels faster than any ship ever built. I did the arithmetic 100 times. I could sell the factory, the warehouse, the stores. I could pay the maids what they were owed and keep the orphanage lit a little longer and start again from a stall in the market with a tray of pens, the way I started the very first time. I knew how to do that. I had done it before, and that was the thing that came loose in me, because I had done it before. 30 years ago, in another world, I built a company out of nothing over a whole lifetime, and one man I trusted, one cold handshake, one cost review, walked away, and let the banks finish me while my own people thanked me on their way out the door. I had crossed an entire world to get clear of that afternoon. And here it was again. The same trapdoor, the same drop, a different face on it, that was all. Twice now, I had spent everything I had to build a floor for people to stand on, and twice, the floor had been the very thing that gave way beneath me. I shut my eyes, and I could not find the bottom of it. For 3 days, I just fell. I did not see what happened at the works while I lay there falling. I have put it together since, from the children, mostly, because the children were the ones who were there. They came to the factory the next morning out of pure habit, the way you go to a place your whole life is kept. And they found it dead, the furnace half full of metal that had cooled in mid-pour, a cup of tea set down half drunk and never come back for, a bar of soap on the bench, unwrapped, waiting for hands that had bolted in the night. Every grown man I employed but one had scattered the moment the word bankrupt went up, and taken what wasn't nailed down as they went. But one stayed, Grant, the drunk I had once dragged off the street and back onto his own 2 feet, the last man in that city anyone would have bet on. He sat in the middle of the wreck stone sober and would not leave. Ken was the first of the children to move. He walked over and shut the furnace down. Then, one at a time, the others picked a task and bent to it, quiet as a held breath. "Somebody'll come to steal all this," one of them said. "Romeo, I think. So we hide it first." They wrapped the tools in cloth, the lathes, the molds, the fine-cut parts Toby and the older boys had spent 2 years learning to make, and they carried them deep into the back of the warehouse and stacked raw stock over them so no looter would ever find them. Small hands, working it out for themselves, in a cold building their whole future had just walked out of. One of the little ones asked, near the end, whether they oughtn't just run too. Ken kept wrapping a lathe head in sacking and did not look up. "That person never ran," he said. "So we don't run either." 11 years old. They were guarding my company for me. They had decided, with not one adult to tell them to, that I was coming back, and they meant to have something left of it for me when I did. At the orphanage, it was softer, and in some ways harder to bear. The grown ones I had taken in off the street when nobody else would. The cook, the painter, the old lecturer, the blacksmith, the carpenter. None of them knew the first thing about banks or bankruptcy, or how to read the papers that had buried me. They could not fight what they did not understand, so they did the only thing they could do. They taught. The lecturer stood a pack of children in front of a slate and told them about the stars. The painter handed out brushes and showed small, dirty hands how to mix a color. The blacksmith taught the careful way to hold fire and warned them off getting hurt, because they were treasures, he said, and treasures don't get to be careless with themselves. Karen the matron bought bread out of her own thin purse. They cooked what the garden gave and shared the eggs the hens laid, and there was nothing spare in any of it. But every single night they kept the lamps lit. They would not let that building go dark, and somewhere in the corner of the dining hall, one night, a small voice said that the president was coming back. Nobody could ever say which child said it first. It just spread, the way the good rumors almost never do. Mouth to mouth in the lamplight, "He's coming back, he's coming back." And the children took it and held onto it and stopped being afraid. The whole grown world outside had made up its mind I was a thief and a coward who would run. Inside that one lit room, a pack of children nobody else had wanted simply refused to believe it. I only heard about the light much later. It is the thing I come back to when I think about the bottom. I surfaced once in the dark before the third dawn, and my 2 wives were standing at the foot of the bed, and they believed I was asleep. Kate was talking low and flat, in the voice she keeps for numbers that refuse to add up. She had gone back to the safe and looked at it properly this time. The hinges, the plate, the lock. There was not a scratch anywhere on it. No pry marks, no break. She set 2 fingers against the lock plate. "It wasn't forced," she said. "It was opened with a key." The room went very still, because a safe opened with a key is not bad luck, and it is not a storm, and it is not a rumor slipping its leash. It is a person. Someone inside the house, with the trust and the access, who had walked up to it and turned a key and gutted me from the middle. Neither of them said the name. I could feel them both not saying it. The same name. The man who had grumbled for months. The man I had already forgiven once. Sarah, my gentle one, wondered aloud whether they ought to make him talk. "Then what?" Kate answered. "We prove it," Sarah said. Kate laid it out over me as if I weren't there. Who had access to the safe? Who had drawn on the accounts? Where the money went? Who moved the documents? What the bank's own records would show to anyone who could read them. And Kate could read them better than anyone alive. Sarah would go to her father at the Merchant Association the moment the sun was up, before the bankruptcy was ever formally filed, and buy us the standing and the days we needed to fight. "This is not revenge," Kate said then, to Sarah, or to me, or only to the dark. "It's our credit. We take it back." Outside the window, it was still that hour before any light at all, and I lay there with my eyes shut and my chest aching. And for the first time in 3 days, the wheel in my head stopped grinding on why and caught at last on who. There was one more thing I did not learn for a long time, and when I did, it was the hardest of all to stay angry about. Ethan, the friend from the old world, the maker whose machine had thrown me across it, had opened that safe with his own 2 hands. He had stolen nothing. He had been told there was an emergency, that money had to reach a client that very night, or the house would fall. That with me a month away and unreachable, there was no one else who could do it. So he did what a decent man does. He opened it clean, without a single scratch, because that was how good he was. And he watched the cash and the bank passbooks and the seals and the papers go into another man's hands, and he thought he was saving me. It was days before he understood there had been no emergency, that the urgent client had never existed, that his clever hands had been the key somebody else turned. They tell me he shut himself in his workshop after that and would not come out. He sat among his broken gears and his failed machines as if they were a jury, and could not make himself look at another living face. He would have stayed there, I think, until it killed him. Except a little girl from the orphanage climbed the stairs with a tray she could barely hold, vegetable soup, black bread, tea, and knocked until he shouted at her to just leave it and go. She came in anyway. Children that small have not yet learned they are supposed to be frightened of a grown man's grief. She went straight to the toys on his shelves, a bird on a spring, a rabbit whose eyes blinked open and shut, and told him she liked the rabbit best. He had made those. He had made one for every child in that house once, a different little face on each, sitting up whole nights to finish them. And then she looked up and asked him, plainly, why he didn't just come and be with everyone else. He froze on it. She saw his face and asked if he was hurt somewhere, and told him he ought to see a doctor if he was. That was what undid him. He caught that child up and held onto her and broke apart. And when she asked him where it hurt, he could only get out that it was his chest. She never asked what he had done. She only held a fistful of his shirt and would not let go. Uncle, she said, everyone's waiting. He stood up still holding her and walked out toward the lit windows and the sound of the others. And somewhere on those stairs, he decided he was finished hiding, that he was going to face what his hands had done and help set it right, whatever it cost him. I knew none of that yet, but that was the night the man who opened my safe started the long walk back toward me. And Nolan, the hand inside my house, the one who had turned Ethan's trust into a key, Nolan did not sleep at all. I have thought a great deal since about what those nights of his must have been. A cold wind rattling the study window like a room full of hands clapping for a thing he could not stand having done. Him wrapped in a blanket with his eyes wide open in the dark, and in the corner, a plain sack. The money, the documents, the passbook, the seal, and, he kept telling himself, the president's own trust, sitting there in a bag on the floor of his home. He had not done it out of greed. I have to be fair about that, even now. Years before I ever knew him, he had owed a hard man a great deal, and that man came back to collect, and made it very clear that he knew which road Nolan's child took home. That was the lever they used on him, not gold. A father's fear. He kept whispering to himself that he had had no choice, that it was all for his family, and every time he said it, the words boxed him in tighter instead of setting him loose. Because he kept remembering the wrong things. The night I had forgiven him the first time, when I could have thrown him out and hadn't. The cups we had shared. The day I put the money in his hands and told him I was counting on him. He would whisper that he had to give it all back. And then, in the same breath, ask the dark how a traitor was ever meant to look me in the face again. He pulled the blanket up over himself and he shook. And he did not know, none of them knew, that a lamp had already been lit against him before dawn, and that 2 women were already coming. On the 3rd morning, I opened my eyes, and the knots in the ceiling weren't laughing anymore. They were just knots in a board. I lay there, and I took stock the way I take stock of anything, coldly, one line at a time. I had lost the company. My name was mud in a city that had been glad of me a month ago. My heart, the doctor said, might not survive another blow like the last one. That was the whole of the ledger, and it read as badly as any ledger I have ever read, and said against all of it, this. Somewhere across town, a pack of children were guarding my tools in the dark because they had decided I was coming home. A drunk I had once saved was sitting sober in my ruined factory and would not leave it. A good man was climbing out of the bottom of his own guilt to try to make it right. And 2 women were awake before the sun, turning a single key scratch nobody else had noticed into a case. Not one of them had given up on me. It would have been a poor sort of thanks to give up on myself. I put my feet on the floor. My legs did not want to hold me, and I made them. I had built all of this out of nothing once before, in a world that owed me even less than this one, with a battered old hat and a handful of borrowed coins. And I had built it because a friend of mine once starved while I stood by too poor to stop it, and I had sworn I would never stand by again. A vow like that does not get to end in a bed. Whoever had turned a key in my house was going to learn the one thing the man 30 years ago never bothered to find out. You can take everything a builder owns. You cannot take the part of him that knows how to build. I got dressed. There was a factory to clean out, and I was not going to leave the children to do it alone. Rest, the doctor said, and he said it like a verdict. Whatever else happened, I was not to lift a hand, not to raise my voice, not to let the tired thing in my chest work any harder than it had to. He packed his bag and left me flat on my back, in a room full of light I could not use. I had lost the company. I had lost the name over the gate. I had spent 30 years learning how to build, and now I could not sit up without the ceiling tilting. For 3 days, that had been the whole of my world. Then Kate came in with a ledger under her arm, and Sarah came in a step behind her, and I understood that the world had gotten larger again while I wasn't watching. They had been shielding me, keeping the worst of it out of the room, feeding me broth and quiet, letting me believe the fight could wait until I could stand for it. That morning, the shielding stopped. Kate set the ledger down on the blanket where I could see it and told me, flat as a level, that a man does not empty a safe he cannot open. Someone had turned a key in my house. She was going to prove exactly whose hand it was. I caught her wrist. Not blood, I said. By the law. Whatever we do goes through the guards and the books. Not a mob, not a knife. A mob was what a ruined man was supposed to become, and I was finished being what these people expected. Something eased in her face that wasn't softness. She'd been hoping I would say that, she told me, because the books were a better weapon than any blade, and she already knew how to read them. Sarah bent and kissed my forehead and said I had exactly one job left, to lie still and get better. And then the two of them walked out of that quiet room to go to war on my behalf. Two women, two fronts. Sarah would open the doors. Kate would spring the trap. What happened after that, I had from them in pieces. Later, when it was already done. This is the way they told it. Sarah went to her father first. He sat near the head of the Merchant Association, the body that governed every trading house in the city. And he had spent his whole life inside one hard rule. In commerce, credit is everything. And once a name loses it, that name does not come back. Sarah laid it in front of him plainly. The company's bills had been dishonored. The gate wore a default notice. The accounts were frozen, and the signboard she had married into was, in the eyes of the market, already dead. She asked him whether he could help them rebuild. He did not lie to her. The old name was beyond saving, he said. A dishonored house never rises again under its own banner. Not in this city, not ever. Sarah felt her hope going out of her like heat off a cooling stone. Then he leaned forward and handed her the other half of it. Names die, he told her. People don't. Trust clings to people, not to signboards. And her husband's own credit was very far from dead. Half the district still talked about the man who fed orphans and had never once run from a debt in his life. So let the ruined name go. Found a new house, staff it with the same trusted people, and the credit would simply follow the people into it. Trust clings to people, not to signboards, he said again, slower, so she would carry it out the door whole. She crossed the room and put her arms around him and thanked him, twice, and went home with a road forward that had not existed an hour before. Before the bankruptcy could even be formally filed, the association would give the new house its standing and its time. That was the ground everything else would stand on. Kate went to the books. Everyone else had looked at the wreck and seen a robbery. The emptied safe, the broken storerooms, the money simply gone. Kate looked at the same room and saw a confession, because a real robbery leaves marks, and this one had left almost none. The safe had not been forced. It had been opened, and a thing that is opened rather than broken is opened by a man who was handed the way in. She started where the money lived and walked it backward, patient as a woman counting stitches. Who held keys to the safe? Who could draw on the accounts before they froze? Which documents had gone missing and which had been left behind on purpose to point the wrong direction? She read the withdrawal records the way I read a stalled machine, and she found the seam almost at once. The final withdrawal had been entered 3 days into my month away, long after I'd sailed. At the 1 hour, the whole house believed no one was left counting. Every flow of money, traced back, bent toward the same man, the sales chief, the one who had sat in taverns, letting his gratitude curdle into grievance, and then gone very quiet. Nolan. She did not rage. She wrote it down. When she finally set the pen aside, she set it to the cold, empty room, level as ever. So it was one of our own. And then she gathered the whole clean chain of it, took it to the city guards, filed her report, and asked them in that same flat voice to search his house. The search did not take long. They found the goods pushed to the back of a cupboard and stuffed under the floorboards. Soap and small manufactured things still wearing the company's own markings, the marks I had pressed into them with my own hands. They found gold coins that no sales chief's wages could ever account for. It was all there, and it was badly hidden, the way a man hides things when some buried part of him half wants them found. Nolan didn't run. That was the piece that stayed with me when they told it. He was standing in his own doorway when the guards came up the path, and he looked at the coins in their hands and the marks on the soap, and he bowed his head and held out his wrists. Not a word of protest, no excuse, no bluster, no denial. Just a man lowering his head like a stone he'd carried too far had finally been set down, and something in him was almost grateful for the weight going. Kate watched him do it without a flicker. She had built the trap plank by plank, and here it was, shut. There was no triumph in her face, she said, only the cold arithmetic of a debt being entered at last on the correct side of the ledger. They took him away down the darkening road, and behind him, that same evening, something warmer was happening clear across the district that nobody had arranged at all. The boys came back. The moment word went round the district that the master had returned, sick, ruined, laid flat on his back, but returned. They came pouring back to the factory they'd been guarding in the dark. Nobody sent for them. Nobody paid them. They came because I was home. Ken was first through the gate, the way he was first at everything, shouting that he'd heard the master was back. Was it true? Was it really true? Behind him came the rest of them, the young workers and the older orphans, the ones who had shut the cold furnace and hidden the tools deep under the raw stock, and flatly refused to believe the city's verdict on me. Not one of them asked whether the company still had a name to its gate. They only wanted to see me. I have turned that evening over a great deal since. For years, I told told myself I was building a factory. Walls, machines, a payroll, a ledger that balanced. What I had actually built, without quite meaning to, was a yard full of children who would run toward a ruined man in the dark, because once he had run toward them. The mansion had been thick with grief for 3 days. That evening, the grief turned, quietly and all at once, into something with its teeth set, focused, cold, ready. Every small kindness I had handed out and forgotten was coming back to me now at interest, and I had not lifted a single finger to call it in. They questioned Nolan that same night. He sat bound to a chair under a single lamp, pale and shaking. A man already 3/4 emptied out. The interrogator laid it before him without cruelty and without mercy, both. Every thread of evidence was gathered, the money traced, the goods marked, the records read end to end. There was no seam left to slip through, no version of the story that fit the facts except the true one. Then he struck the table once and asked the only question that still mattered. Who put you to it? Nolan broke. It came out of him all at once, the way water comes through a cracked wall. He'd been threatened. He wept. He'd had no choice at all. They had held an old debt over his head and then asked him, soft as anything, whether he cared what happened to his family. A rival house had bought him, and its president had done the buying with his own mouth. Kate's report already had a name waiting in it, and now Nolan gave that same name up in tears to a room full of guards. Gideon. He wasn't lying to save his skin. There was nothing left of it to save. He was a coerced man finally setting down a stone he'd hauled too long, and the setting down wrecked him. I won't pretend I felt nothing watching that later in my mind. He had betrayed me, and he had been broken into betraying me, and both of those were true in the very same breath, and I have never once found the clean edge between them. The mood in the room shifted while he talked. The guards understood exactly what they were hearing, that the trembling man in the chair was not the top of this thing, that a colder hand had reached down out of the dark and moved him like a piece. And that hand had a house, and a name, and an address on the far side of the city. They took Gideon that very same day. I want to tell this part slowly because I think I've earned the telling of it. Here was a man who had schemed entirely from the shadows. He had never once dirtied his own hands. He had bought a frightened father to turn a key for him, and then sat back in his fine house behind his fine name, while another man carried all the risk and all the guilt. Bold from the dark. Untouchable, he believed, because he had built a whole living man in between himself and the crime. The guards came for him at his own door, and his boldness lasted exactly as long as the shadows did. The instant the light found him, the instant the captain spoke the charge aloud, and the deniability he'd hidden behind simply evaporated. The rival house president came apart at the seams. He denied everything. He had never heard that name in his life, he said. Whatever Nolan had done alone. This was a mistake, a misunderstanding, a monstrous outrage. His voice climbed and cracked on the outrage. He backed away from the doorway, and there was nowhere left to back to. And for one breath, I let myself stand exactly where he stood. Everything that man had was deniability, and now it was gone, peeled off him in a single sentence in front of witnesses, and under it, there had never been one thing. No spine, no courage, only a small, cold creature who had always, secretly, known that if the light ever reached him, he would have nothing at all to show it. The floor was gone from under him. He had spent his whole life making certain someone else would be standing in this spot instead of him, and now here he was, in the spot. And the true horror of it was that it was finally, only him. Then the captain's hand closed on his arm, and the man who had been so bold in the dark folded down into a sniveling wreck, begging, blaming, weeping, denying all the way into the waiting carriage. "Make your excuses at the station," the captain told him, and shut the carriage door on his face. Kate watched the whole thing through to the end. When the carriage finally rolled off into the dark, she let out a long breath she seemed to have been holding for a month. She didn't smile. She stepped close to where the wheels had stood and said it very quietly, to no one, to all of them at once. "This is the price for the pain you caused my master." Then she turned and she walked away into the night. Kate came to my room that night to report. She stood at the foot of the bed and told it plainly, start to finish. The audit, the search, the arrest, the confession, the name, the carriage door shutting. The rival house had collapsed in a single day, so quietly that the city outside had scarcely noticed a thing. The men who had emptied my house and branded me a runaway thief were sitting in cells. The new house had its standing. The boys were back in the yard. By every measure that could be written into a ledger, we had won. I lay there and looked at her, and the two of us knew the one thing no ledger could hold, because I had watched this kind of scheme work from the very beginning, and Gideon was not the man who builds one. Gideon was a coward in a fine coat. Cowards do not design a trap this clean. They get handed one, already made. Somewhere above him, there had been a colder, cleaner hand. The broker who had marked my house from the shadows the way he marked everything he touched, the one who preyed on the very children I'd been quietly pulling off his books, one soup bowl at a time. His name had never once entered that interrogation room. Nolan had never even known it to give. The confession had climbed as high as Gideon and stopped there dead, at exactly the height it had been built to stop. We had caught the knife. We had not caught the hand. Kate knew it as well as I did. I could read it in the set of her mouth, even in that low light. She had won her revenge, and she was clear-eyed enough to despise how unfinished it was. The man who had actually actually done this to us had watched his own tools fall and lost nothing for it. Not a coin, not a name, not one night's sleep. And he was still out there in the dark, already deciding what he'd build next out of other people's children. I told her to go and rest. There was a house to raise from nothing all over again, and a reckoning still owed in the open, in daylight, in the square, where the whole city could stand and watch it paid. But all of that was for when I could get to my feet. The man who had taken everything from me had a name. I simply didn't have it yet. The whole city came out to hear it read. I stood at the edge of the square with Kate at my shoulder and watched a court official climb the low step, unroll the account she had built out of my own ruined books, and read it aloud to every soul who could press within earshot. He did not hurry. He read it the way you read a ledger that has already been checked twice and found true. Let it be known, he called out over their heads, that the merchant house of this man was not lost to debt, nor to folly, nor to any weakness of his own. It was emptied on purpose. His own sales chief was turned against him, his strong room drained by a bought hand, and the master himself branded a runaway thief to bury the theft under his name. And all of it was ordered by a rival who could not beat him in the open, and so chose to unmake him in the dark. I had heard those facts 100 times by then. Kate had. But there is a particular thing that happens to the truth when it is spoken out where everyone can hear it. And I stood there and felt it happen. For months, this same crowd had traded the other story back and forth like a warm coin. That I had run off to the empire with some woman. That I had wronged a woman and fled the shame. That the great house had simply collapsed under a fool who overreached. They had believed it because it was easy, and because I had not been there to make them ashamed of believing it. Now the official reached the end of the page and let it drop, and I watched the easy story die on a few hundred faces at once. A woman near the front put her hand over her mouth. A man who I would have wagered had repeated the runaway lie in a tavern went a slow, ugly red. The murmur that had filled the square curdled into something lower and harder, and it was not aimed at me anymore. Kate did not look at the crowd. She looked at the step where the paper had fallen, and the corner of her mouth moved just once, the way it does when a column finally sums to the figure she already knew it would. Then, the guards brought the two of them out into the light. Gideon first, then Nolan, walked down the middle of the street on their own 2 feet with a guard at each elbow, in full public view of the city they had lied to. This was the part I had promised myself would happen in daylight, in the open, where it could not be whispered away. And it happened exactly as I had wanted it, and not one hand was raised. There were no stones. Nobody rushed the line. The guards did not have to hold anyone back, because the city had already found the only weapon it needed, and it was the truth in its own mouth. "Betrayers," someone said, not loudly, and then it was everywhere. "You ruined an honest house. He fed your children, and this is what you did to him. Shame, shame on you both." It came from the doorways and the windows and the fronts of the shops, a steady falling weight of contempt from every neighbor these two had ever looked down on. That was the whole of it. No blood. Only every good name they had spent their lives building, stripped off them in the space of one walk down one street. Gideon kept his head down. The man who had schemed so boldly from behind his fine name could not lift his face to a single one of them now. This was the same man who had never dirtied his own hands, who had sat in a fine house behind a fine name and moved other men like counters on a board. And here he was, on his own 2 feet in the middle of the street, with nothing between himself and the whole city's contempt anymore. Not one counter left to hide behind. Every neighbor he had ever quietly despised was giving him back, all at once, exactly what he had always thought of them. I had wondered, honestly, whether I would want to shout something at him when the moment finally came. I had pictured it more than once from my sickbed, some cutting thing I would say to his face. I found, standing there, that I did not want it at all. There was nothing I could say that the street was not already saying better, and a man does not need to raise his own voice when a whole city has found the truth and will not stop repeating it. Nolan walked beside him, hollow and gray, and he did not defend himself either. He had been a frightened father with a debt and a threat held over his family, and he had made the worst possible choice out of the worst possible corner. I would have my own reckoning to make with him, in time, about mercy and what a man who was once forgiven owes. But that was not for the square. In the square, he was only a man carrying the full weight of what he had done, and letting it be carried. The guards led them on and around the corner, and the noise followed them the whole way, and then they were gone from sight, and the sound went with them. The square emptied into a strange, settling quiet. "It's over," I said. Kate let out a long breath, one she seemed to have been holding since the day I came home to a nailed gate. "Yes," she said, "now, at last." And then whatever she meant to add simply trailed away into the hush, unfinished, and I did not ask her to finish it. I think we both knew the shape of the thing she had swallowed. I lifted my face instead. Above the rooftops, the sky had gone a clean, endless blue, the kind of blue that does not care what any of us have done to each other down here. And I stood in the middle of it and let the long nightmare lift off me like it was being washed clean away. A few days later, the quiet in my sick room broke all on its own. I was still mending, still under the doctor's orders to keep to the bed and let the heart settle, and I had drifted half asleep in the warm afternoon light when a noise from outside pulled me back. Not one noise, a rising churn of it, 100 small voices somewhere down past the gate, climbing. I got an elbow under myself before the door had even opened. "Master, I'm coming in," the butler said, and came in and put a firm hand flat against my shoulder before I could get any higher than that. "And you will please stay exactly where you are." I asked him what in the world the racket was. He straightened, and for a man so careful with his face, he looked oddly close to undone. More than 100 children had come to the house, he told me. The children of my workers, and the orphans, and the ones who used to line up for soup. All of them, together, pouring up to the gate to see whether it was true that the master had come home. 3 of them got past him before he could stop it. My little section chiefs, Ken, who I had put over the candle bench, and Romeo, who ran the soap, and a fierce small girl I had somehow made a sales manager back when the world was normal. They came through the door at a dead run, and they were on the bed, and on me, before the butler could get a word out. "You're really here," Ken said into my collar, and could not seem to say anything after that. Then it all came out of the 3 of them at once, tumbling over each other. Every terrible thing they had heard while I was gone. That I had run away to the Empire with a woman. That I had done something wicked to a woman and fled. That the whole company had gone bankrupt and been swallowed. That the sales chief had been the one going around whispering it all into people's ears. "When you disappeared," said Romeo, quiet where Ken was loud, "we didn't know what to do. Nobody would tell us anything true." The girl pushed herself up off my chest and lifted her chin, and there was so much pride in her small dirty face that it stopped my breath. "But we hid them," she said. "The tools, all the good equipment. We hid it before anyone could come and take it." Ken picked it up, half shouting now. "We moved all of it, every lathe part, every mold, the good iron, the president's own machines. We hid it so they couldn't steal it while you were gone. We kept it safe, all of us. We didn't let them have it." I lay there and looked at the 3 of them and past them at the doorway where the butler stood, and I could not make a single word come out for a moment. While the grown men fled and the rumors spread, and my house was picked apart from the inside, these children had gathered up my life's work in their own thin arms and carried it into hiding, piece by heavy piece, and stood guard over it in the dark. They had kept the faith when every adult they knew had let go of it. They had believed against the plain evidence of an empty gate and a nailed notice and a city full of people calling me a thief, that I would come back, and they had made certain there would be something left for me to come back to. I had spent a lot of years telling myself that the people I cared about got thrown away and went hungry, and I was never quite enough to stop it. That had been the truest thing about me for as long as I could remember. And now, here was the exact opposite of it, piled onto my chest and shouting into my collar, the ones the whole world throws away, refusing to be thrown, refusing to let me be thrown either. "Thank you," I finally managed, and my voice came out rough enough that Ken looked up in alarm. "Thank you. You have no idea what you saved." Then I got a hand on each small head I could reach, and I made them a promise. "You protected what was mine," I told them. "So now it's my turn. From here on, I protect you. If you're hungry, you come to me. If anyone gives you trouble, anyone at all, you come to me. There is nothing you can carry to me that I won't help you carry. Do you understand?" The butler chose that exact moment to remember his duty. "You lot," he said, scandalized, trying to peel a small chief off each of my arms. "The master is ill. Get down, get down." But he was smiling when he said it, and the churn of 100 voices out past the gate had changed while I wasn't listening. It had gone from something frightened into something else entirely. It sounded, if I am honest, like hope. When I could stand on my own again, we raised a new sign over the gate. The children gathered under it, all of them, scrubbed and fed and craning up at the fresh painted letters. And one of the small ones tugged my sleeve and asked me the question I had been waiting to answer for a long time. What did the name mean? Why Copper Hat? So I told them. "There was a stretch of my life," I said, "back before any of this, when I was not a president of anything, when I was a stranger with nothing, in a strange city, going hungry in cold streets a lot like the ones I found some of you in. I was close enough to the end that I could feel it. And what stood between me and that end was not very much at all. It was an old hat the color of copper that somebody had thrown away, and a few coins a stranger left in it when I had nothing else in the world. That is where all of it started," I told them. "Not the company I built before, not any grand thing, just a battered old hat and a handful of coins, and a stranger who decided a man he'd never met was worth a few coppers. And every single one of you," I said, and I made myself look around at all of them, "started exactly the same way I did, with nothing at all. I did not expect what happened next. They started laughing, not at me, but with the whole thing, and trading it back and forth like it was the finest game in the world. One boy called out that he had started with a crust of bread. A girl held up her foot and swore her whole fortune had once been a pair of shoes, with no soles left in them. A little one in the back said all he'd owned was a bundle of rags, and said it proudly, like it was treasure, because now it was. So that's the name," I told them over the noise. Copperhat, the orphanage too. Copperhat, all of it. Because we all began from nothing once, which means there is nothing in this world that can ever knock us so far down that we can't build back up from it. They took the whole house from us. And here we are. I found Kate on one side of me and Sarah on the other, the two women who had gone out and dragged the truth into daylight while I lay useless in a bed. Kate lifted a cup. She was not a woman given to speeches, and all she said was, "To the company," flat and certain, which from Kate was practically a symphony. Sarah didn't say anything at all. She just smiled at me, that warm, quiet smile, and let her eyes do the rest. I raised my own cup to all of them, the children, the workers, the found and the discarded, and the ones nobody else in this whole city would have taken a second look at. This isn't just a house of business, I said. Understand that, all of you. A house of business can be emptied out and nailed shut in a single afternoon while its master is away. I know, because ours was. This is something they can't empty. This is a place you come home to. It doesn't matter how far down you've been knocked or how little you've got left in your hands when you get here. If you started with nothing, you're already one of us. Every single one of you. To all of us. Long live the company. And they roared it back at me through tears and laughter both. And under that brand new sign, the whole thing was born again as Copperhat. And I stood in the middle of the family that had saved me, and I let the feeling come all the way through for once and did not fight it. I had come into this world swearing I would build the next thing alone, owing no one, so that no one could ever gut me the way I'd been gutted. I want it on the record that I was wrong. Alone would have died in that alley long ago. It was the hat and the coins and the strangers and the children who had kept me alive every single time, and I was finished pretending otherwise. I did not see the first part of what happened that night. I put it together afterward, from the boy and from others, and I have turned it over in my mind enough times since that I can see it plainly, the way you see a thing you were meant to be too late for. A fine carriage came down that same district late in the evening. Inside it rode the man the court never named, the broker who had marked my house from the shadows, who had bought Nolan and armed Gideon, and preyed on the very children I kept pulling off his books one soup bowl at a time. The law had come and gone, and closed its hand on his tools, and never once touched him. He rode home untouched, and I am told he was in a fine humor, already promising himself a drink to toast my ruin. His driver saw the shape in the alley first and slowed, and said there was an orphan boy collapsed against the wall. The broker leaned out and looked. I know what he saw, because it is the only thing that man has ever been able to see. He saw a starved, ragged child too far gone to be worth the trouble of stopping. Not even, he decided, worth the price of selling. So he told the driver to go on, and the driver went on, and the wheels rolled past the boy without so much as slowing, carrying that cold, laughing man off toward his celebration drink. Behind the carriage, in the dark, the boy lifted his face. He got one thin arm up off the cobbles and reached it out after the light of the departing lamps, trying to make a sound and unable to manage even that much. He held the hand out until the carriage turned the far corner and the last of its light was gone, and the alley closed back over him, black and cold and silent. He was still reaching when we came around the other end of the street. We were coming home late from the guild, the three of us, the carriage rocking and warm, and I had my eyes half closed when Kate's hand came down hard on my knee. "There," she said, already at the window. "Someone's collapsed in that alley. Look." Sarah leaned across her to see and went white. "It's a child," she breathed. "Walter, it's a child." I was out the door before the carriage had finished stopping. I heard someone call my name behind me, and I did not slow for it. I was down in the alley and on my knees on the freezing stone, and I got my arms under the little bundle of bones and rags and lifted him against my chest. He weighed nothing. That was the thing that went through me like ice. A boy that age, and he weighed less than the crate of gifts I'd once set down in the road. For one horrible moment, I thought I had come too late, the way I have come too late before, the way I have carried more than one grown man to a doctor only to close his eyes an hour later. Then I felt it, faint and quick and much too shallow, but there, breath. Against my hand, his chest was still moving. "He's still breathing," I said, and I was already up and turning back toward the light. "He's alive! Hurry! Now! Drive! Get us home! Hurry!" We raced through the black streets with the boy wrapped in my coat and Sarah's arms, and Kate's steadiness all around him, and he lived. He was starved and frozen and half gone, and he lived because we had come around the right corner at the right hour, and because none of the three of us is built to ride past a thing like that in the dark. I sat with him shaking in my arms while the wheels tore through the night, and somewhere across that same city, that cold, untouched man was pouring himself the drink he had promised, certain the law would never reach him, certain that men like him always win, and that a child in an alley is worth exactly nothing. He was wrong about the child. I had him in my arms, breathing, and he was going to learn in time how wrong he was about the rest of it too. The court had caught his knife. It had not caught his hand. That man was still out there in the dark with his ledgers full of other people's children, and now I knew that a name like that existed even if I did not yet have it in my mouth. And I had a house behind me, reborn, and a family in it, and 100 children who had already proven what they would carry for me. My old life had ended in one cold handshake in a warehouse gone dark, with the key keys to nothing in my hand. I had promised myself that night that I would never be that man again. It had taken a second ruin in a second world to teach me what I'd had to promise wrong, that the answer was never to build higher walls and owe no one, but to fill the house so full of people who would carry it for me that no single cold handshake could ever bring it down again. I had that house now. I had watched 100 children prove it. Whatever the broker was building out there in the dark, I would be building faster. And this time, I would not be building it alone. The war with him had only just begun.